Are there any constituency statements by honourable members? And I call the member for Fowler.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. My community in Fowler was filled with celebrations in the past few weeks, and I had the honour to participate and share in the great milestones reached by many in my wonderful and diverse communities. Prairie Wood High School marked its 40th anniversary, and Carramar Public School celebrated its 100th birthday. Both schools celebrated its pride and joy in public education. It was great to hear past and present principals, staff and students of both schools talk about how they worked so hard to create an environment of learnings for students to strive for excellence, despite the lack of funding and resources. Education, as we all know, is the key to the future of many young people, and more so for the young people in my community of Fowler, many of whom came from war-ravaged countries. Like me, their parents instilled in them the importance of studying and working hard to be part of this wonderful country that we have now called home. I want to acknowledge the commitment and dedication of staff and principals who continue to soldier on, encouraging our young to learn and reach for the stars. As you know, I have one of the most multi-faith communities in this country. I attended the 100th anniversary of the Fairfield Seventh-day Adventist, marked with inspirational stories and uplifting songs. I want to thank Pastor Edison Akrawi, Pastor Kenneth Strickland and the Fijian Church Choir Group and the congregation for the beautiful service and the lunch served on the day. I was also honoured to be part of the St Rita Melkite Catholic Church of Liverpool 20th anniversary dinner held at the Marconi on the weekend. The St Rita congregation, with its bishop, His Grace Robert Rabat DD, and the parish priest Father Antonius Ibrahim, shared about the importance of the community's faith, while at the same time emphasising the need for us all to embrace our multicultural community and respect one another. There are many other distinguished religious leaders, as well as our local elected and state representatives, who joined in the celebration. Last but not least, being part of the Long Tan Day commemoration, which is now known as Vietnam Veterans Day. This is an important day for me, as it's a reminder to me of the personal sacrifices Australians and Vietnamese Australians have made in defending the freedom and democracy. Many lives have been lost, including innocent lives, in the fight for freedom and democracy. I know for many Vietnam veterans, there are still old wounds, physical and mentally. I want you to know that what you fought for wasn't in vain. It's due to your courage and service to Australia that you have enabled me, my belated mother and siblings, to rebuild a new life here and to have the opportunity to call Australia second homeland. I also want to thank you for your family supporting you through these challenging times. Where I am today and standing in this house is due to your courage and sacrifice, lest we forget.
I call the member for Gilmore.
Deputy Speaker, mental health support is something that I am passionate about because I know how crucial it is to communities in regional and rural areas like my electorate of Gilmore. Providing free, accessible mental health support close to home is particularly important for our young people, which is why I was so pleased last Friday to cut the bright green ribbon and open the long-awaited Headspace service in Kiama. Over the last few years, bushfires, floods and the pandemic have really taken their toll on people's mental health, particularly our young people, and acutely around Kiama following the tragic loss of young lives to suicide. I fought hard on behalf of this devastated community to establish a dedicated Headspace service, which will also support young people living in Gerringong, Jamberoo and surrounding villages. Youth in the Kiama region previously had to travel to Nowra or Wollongong to access Headspace services, but the Albanese government's investment of $839,000 this financial year for the commissioning and operation of the centre will help alleviate these barriers. This close-knit coastal community has had to bear a burden that no one ever wants to experience, and there has been no greater need for a Headspace service than in Kiama, which is why I fought so hard for it. I've seen what a difference Headspace can make to the lives of local young people, delivering the centre I promised in Batemans Bay and seeing the amazing work of Headspace Nowra over many years. I am proud to have delivered this critically important mental health service for young people in Kiama. Deputy Speaker, this month I was also thrilled to cut the ribbon on another important major road project, the Far North Collector Road at Bangalee near Nowra. Fully funded by the Australian Government, the $35 million road will take traffic off the Princess Highway while reducing travel times for residents who travel between North Nowra, Bomaderry and Camberwarra. After consultation with local experts in local Dharawal language, the new road has been named Banada Way, which is Southern Dharawal for Bomaderry Creek or running water. Building the Far North Collector Road network included the construction of 4 new bridges, including the 108-metre long bridge over Bomaderry Creek and floodplain and 3 new roundabouts. The project involved 60,000 tonnes of bridging and drainage materials, 6,000 tonnes of asphalt and more than 10,000 tonnes of concrete. The project supported 250 jobs during construction. This critical piece of infrastructure will benefit the Shoalhaven for decades to come and is yet another example of this government delivering road safety projects that will transform the lives of people living in regional communities.
And I call the member for Grey.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Last night I had the great pleasure of attending the AgriFutures Rural Ribbon of the Year Award in the Great Hall. There were 600 of us there celebrating the best and finest of Australia's young female entrepreneurs in the agricultural sector. It was the award winner was Tanya Egerton. She's from the Northern Territory and she has started up a not-for-profit organisation that is opening up op shops on remote Indigenous communities, bringing in clothes from outside, letting the ladies of the community run the op shop and then putting those profits back into their own communities, and it's highly commendable. As are the other 6 finalist projects. Everything from putting Australian tuna back into tuna tins in Australia, which we haven't, which we used to do in Port Lincoln in my home electorate, and we no longer do. So, to people setting up health services, complementary health services in rural areas. Of course, one of my favourites is the one that comes from my electorate, Nikki Atkinson, who lives in a small community not so far from Port Augusta, but Wilmington, in what we would call Horrocks Pass. And she's established a fashion label where she is making beautiful woolen wedding gowns out of superfine merino wool as they produce on their property. And so Horrocks Vale fashions, and in fact she'll be taking a collection to London in the next couple of weeks at a huge bridal exposition there. So good luck to Nikki. The reason I harbour on Nikki a bit is that she comes from my hometown of Kimber, in fact my home community of Buckleboo. And I went to school with her father, and I've watched Nikki grow up, and both her parents and her are personal friends. And I'm driven to also inform the Parliament that there were 3 SA finalists vying for this position to compete last night. One of the others also came from my home community of Buckleboo. In fact, grew up on the farm alongside me, and her brother now leases part of my property. So Susie Williams lives down the Fleurieu Peninsula and is involved now, has started up a platform delivering news services to agriculture communities. So it's tick, 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 tick. There were 6 ticks there last night, 7 ticks, I think, and a great celebration of agriculture and of the females that work and make a real difference in agriculture communities. Because one thing we do know, I'm one of those people who managed to establish a successful farm on the back of the knowledge that the way to your farm to succeed is to marry a school teacher or a nurse and provide off-farm income. I'm not the only one that's chosen that pathway, but those women that join us in the job of feeding Australia are wonderful and excel.
I call the Minister for the National Disability Insurance Scheme and Government Services.
Thank you. Last Friday I attended the funeral of Sarah Carter at Flemington Racecourse. She was just 45 years old. I acknowledge the loss to her family, and I acknowledge her mother Gaynor, who's listening to this as we speak. Sarah was the first woman to be elected Mayor of Maribyrnong 3 times, and only the second Mayor in the municipality's history to achieve emeritus status, the highest recognition for distinguished service in local government leadership. She received multiple awards for her contribution to the council since she was first elected in 2008, and she was serving her 4th consecutive term. She was simply the most decorated female councillor in a city that was established in 1859. Sarah was passionate about Maribyrnong and the local community. She lived a life of service with her work grounded in grassroots community engagement. There was an energy, enthusiasm and creative thinking and fearlessness to Sarah which was unmatched. Sarah was also a tireless international advocate. Those gathered at the service heard of Sarah's remarkable efforts with the charity organisation Save the Children. Matt Tinkler, CEO of the organisation, spoke beautifully of shared memories, of offering Miss Carter the job of leading a program to visit aid and development programs overseas, which one friend described as her life's work. Mr. Tinkler said that Sarah called it her dream job, but he said to her, "I think you're the dream candidate." She will also be remembered for her fight to reinstate IVF treatments during COVID lockdowns. In the weeks that have passed since we learned of Sarah's death, she's been remembered as a force of nature. In the words of her mother, an intelligent, vivacious, caring woman who set out singly to make a difference in many people's lives. She had the ability to make every individual feel like they were the most important person in the room. Her father, David, said that despite the overwhelming loss of his daughter, he felt immense pride that her life had been marked by unwavering dedication, compassion, a fierce commitment to making the world a better place. It's now the job of all of us who knew Sarah to make sure that her legacy lives on, and I acknowledge the Australian Workers' Union will have a memorial prize for their women members named after her. Victorian Minister Natalie Hutchins spoke passionately. A long-time friend and mentor, she spoke at the funeral, remembering Sarah as brilliant and captivating, a brilliant and captivating woman, and sorely missed. I think it's a fitting tribute to Sarah that there will be an award who didn't just break but smash the glass ceiling. I'd also like to thank so many federal MPs, including Coalition MPs, Michael McCormack, Darren Chester and Dan Tehan, along with Sharon Clayton, who flew into state, and Victorian federal MPs who were there. Who knows what Sarah could have accomplished next? We all regret her passing. She was a passionate children's champion. She was a community leader who represented the best of Labor. She will be missed. Sarah Carter was the best of us.
I call the member for Hinkler.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. Well, the Olympics might be over, but it's only halfway, and we've got the Paralympics coming up. But like every member in this place, we had a number of participants in the Olympics, and I do want to give them a shout out because they performed exceptionally well, coming from regional Queensland all the way to Paris. Taran Golcheski, who is a teacher in Bundaberg, would you believe? Olympic debut for the discus. She went in ranked 30th. She finished in 15th place and threw a personal best of 62.36 metres. Now, I'm sure Ms Golcheski will be warmly welcomed back by her students, pupils. They'll be very excited to hear all about the Olympics. Matt Hauser, the triathlon man from Hervey Bay, finished 7th. That is Australia's best men's result in the Olympics in 2 decades. He is a machine. He was part of the mixed relay, and the Team Australia finished in 12th place. And of course, we all saw the footage swimming in the sign, so he should get an award for bravery as well. Isaac Cooper from Bundaberg in the swimming, swam in the 100-metre backstroke. He was part of the 4x100-metre medley relay team, which placed 6th in the final. An incredible athlete, works really hard. Rebecca Greiner, member of the Hockeyroos from Bundaberg, made her Olympic debut as well. The Hockeyroos were unbeaten in Pool B, but unfortunately went down to China in the quarterfinals. And Shannon Davey, the boy from Narrabri, but he moved to Bundaberg to train with Attila Kovacs, so we're claiming him. He's with us, and he's in the green and gold tracksuit, so he's definitely one of ours in Australia. Trains at the Attila Boxing Academy. But in the Paralympics, Madam Deputy Speaker, we've got some absolute champions. Reid McCracken from Bundy, he's in the 100-metre T34, the 800-metre T34. It will be his 4th Paralympics. He won silver in Tokyo, he won silver in Rio, he won silver in London, and I know he's going to go all out to get one more at the Olympics in Paris. Sam Schmidt, Bundaberg discus thrower on the F38, competed in the Tokyo Olympics, she finished 6th. Came into my office just in the last couple of weeks. She's a lovely young lady. I think my staff were more excited to meet her than anyone else. She was very much welcomed and just a ball of fun. Kira Stevens from Hervey Bay, the 100-metre breaststroke SB9 and the 200 individual medley SM10. She made a Paralympic debut at Tokyo where she won bronze, and she broke the Australian record with a personal best. Madam Deputy Speaker, in the last few seconds I've got left, I just want to thank one of my staff, Liz Carson. Liz has put her notice in after 9 years of service to my office as a media advisor. Everyone in this place knows it's the media advisor that gets the 4 a.m. call to see if the boss can be on at 5. They also get the late night call to show up to run the live view for Sky. Liz has been a wonderful part of my office, and she leaves us with our gratitude, with my gratitude. I wish her and the girls the best of luck in her new ventures, and we'll still hopefully see you out on the polling booths, Liz. We're looking forward to some more help, but good luck with the new adventure, and thank you so much for your service. You've been a wonderful part of the team.
I call the member for Lingiari.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I take the opportunity today to mark the recent death of Carol Taylor, a long-time and highly respected Labor branch member in my electorate of Lingiari. Carol passed away peacefully earlier this month in Alice Springs Palliative Care Unit. Carol came to Alice Springs from her home in Victoria. Carol was the CEO of the Drug and Alcohol Services of Australia from 2014 to 2022. A lifelong true believer, Carol was a fierce advocate for reducing the devastation from drugs, alcohol and other addiction problems and their impacts on people's lives and in the community. Carol made sure no one was left behind and the most vulnerable people received the care they deserve. It was often said if you came into Alice Springs looking for Carol Taylor, just look for the person doing the toughest job. Carol was always ready for a challenge, and she was a special person who gave freely of herself without question and throughout her life. Carol spent many years working for the Hawke and Keating governments, most notably in the office of Minister Peter Staples. She was widely admired by her peers and for her ability and skills. Carol worked hard as the senior private secretary, negotiating with cabinet ministers to loosen their grip on their funding for achieving better policy and program outcomes, especially in our aged care and particularly for regional and remote areas of Western Australia, the Northern Territory and Queensland. She was a committed champion for improving the lives of others. Carol hated flying in small planes, but regularly made the trips throughout remote Northern Australia to make sure ministers and staff saw firsthand the conditions of what people were living under. She was the flag bearer for social justice issues and a great fighter for the rights of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians. Her life was one of commitment and service. She made a real difference to the lives of so many, and she had a deep love and compassion to leave something of lasting value for Australia. This is how Carol lived her life right to the very end. She'll be missed. My condolences go to her extended family and to the many friends, and I particularly mention the former member for Lingiari, Warren Snowden, who was a very close friend, and I was lucky enough to know her. Farewell, Carol Taylor. Your legacy will always shine bright.
I call the member for Braddon.
Deputy Speaker. Deputy Speaker, the Albanese government's list of broken promises to the electorate of Braddon and the great state of Tasmania is long, but it's getting longer, Deputy Speaker. The local Labor representative says that she is, quote, building a better Braddon. But, Deputy Speaker, nothing's being built thanks to this government. Business owners are telling me loud and clear that things are pretty bleak. Labor's created a cost of living crisis and a cost of doing business crisis, which often isn't talked about. No industry in Braddon is safe from their economic wrecking ball, and their mantra appears to be delay, delay, delay. Kick it down the road. I quote, when it comes to approvals through the EPBC, the Environmental Protection Biodiversity Act of 1999. On Tasmania's west coast, the mineral epicentre of Tasmania, Minister Plibersek refuses to provide certainty for salmon farming in Macquarie Harbour. The minister's inaction is impacting the entire community right across the west coast and threatening the state's salmon industry. There's no scientific evidence that demonstrates the removing of aquaculture from Macquarie Harbour, which is 7 times the size of Sydney Harbour, will ensure the future of the Maugean skate. It's dishonest to lay the blame at the feet of the salmon industry, and it's time for this unnecessary EPBP process to end. Go just an hour up the road to the Rosebery MMG mine, and they continue to wait for Minister Plibersek to make the decision on their critical tailings dam facility at South Marionoak as an alternative storage option for their fast-reaching capacity. Years of delay, lack of leadership is risking the livelihoods of 550 workers, 550 families, Deputy Speaker. Just above that is Robbins Island, where wind farm proponents are waiting for, guess what? An EPBC approval, kicking it down the road. This would be a massive boost for renewable energy in the great state. It will provide clean energy for tens of thousands of homes and create hundreds of jobs, drive billions of dollars of economic development in our region. The project has undergone some of the most rigorous approvals in the world. It's time to get it done. Let these industries know how they can move forward. Located within the recently announced Northwest Renewable Energy Zone, the project is situated perfectly to feed into the proposed Marinus Link and the Northwest Transmission Development Upgrade. The Albanese government should be giving this priority. The only thing that you can trust about this government is that they will continue to stifle Braddon's economic prosperity, and I call on the respective ministers to look after and to prosecute the expedience of these approvals for these valuable industries in the great state of Tasmania.
I call the member for Hunter.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. The Hunter has produced a stack of professional and elite athletes. I want to make sure that we support the next crop of our local sporting talent so that our next generation of superstars comes from the Hunter too. Unfortunately, talent and determination alone isn't always enough to reach the top. Participating in high-level sport comes at a cost, and it's mostly parents who put their hands in their pockets to get their children to competitions. The Local Sporting Champions program provides financial assistance to young people to compete, coach or umpire in their chosen sport. I know firsthand how expensive your chosen sports can be, especially when you're competing on the state, national or international stage. These small grants make a lot of difference to the athletes and their parents. Speaker, I want to congratulate our recent local sporting champions. Alira Brennan, Lucy Bender, Isabel Walters, Kira Walters, Taylor Coford, Charlotte Moore, Madison Fairley, Lily Stewart, Molly Bailey, Matilda Bailey, Sienna Proctor, Olivia Waring and Grace Brislane represented the Cessnock District Netball Association at the Junior Hart State Titles. Sienna Downey also participated in junior state titles representing Westlakes Netball Association. Jade Constable also went to the state titles representing Muswellbrook Netball Association. Scarlett Cox from Cessnock High School competed in a state level in diving. Carrie Phillips competed in the Hunter Hurricanes at the Australian Youth Water Polo Championships. Kira Carlson from YE Point participated in the athletics at the Australian Track and Field Championships. Kai McDermott from Mingara Aquatic Swim Club went to the Australian Age Championships for swimming. Zane Burke went to the World Championships for BMX. Bethany Klepzig represented New South Wales NSWPSSA at the School Sports Swimming Australian Championships. Kia Lee represented Australia at the 2024 World Aquatic Men's Under-16s Water Polo Championships. Ben Frost represented New South Wales Country at the Australian Youth Championships in baseball. Cameron Gawn from NUSM SWIM Swim Club went to the National Age Championships for swimming. Gru Creamer competed at the Pro MX Series for motorcycle New South Wales. Lexi Phillips from Novocastrian Swim Club went to the Australian All-Age and MC Age Swimming Championships. And finally, Jamie Ilfield Bell from Star Club Equestrian Program competed in the CPEDI Paralympic Qualifier at Willing Park. Congratulations to all these local sporting champions. Sport has always been a massive part of the Hunter, and it's amazing to see so many young people from our level still competing at a high level.
I call the member for Bowman.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. And in a very similar theme to the member for Hunter, I want to acknowledge some of the athletes from my electorate who stood on the world stage and competed in the recent Paris Olympic Games. Melissa Wu made the final of the 10-metre diving in her 5th Olympic Games. Gasil Russo finished 4th in the men's competition. Shayna Jack was part of Australia's gold medal winning 400 by 100-metre freestyle team. Stratty local Ethan Ewing did us proud by making the quarterfinals of the surfing competition in Tahiti. Reece Holder ran his fastest ever time to qualify for the semi-finals of the 400-metre sprint, and Birkdale's Shannon Davey made his debut in the boxing. One of the greatest stories of the Games was Jess Fox and Naomi Fox winning 3 gold medals between them in the canoe slalom. In 8 years' time, my community of the Redlands will play host to the canoe slalom events at the 2032 Olympic Games. The Olympic Whitewater Arena in Birkdale is sure to continue to be a rich source of gold for us at the Brisbane Games. 2032 presents us with a unique opportunity. Beyond the 2 weeks of competition, we must ensure a lasting legacy of infrastructure for our community. Sadly, the state Labor government has demonstrated nothing but chaos and confusion when it comes to Games planning. Venues aren't yet sorted, let alone any legacy projects. As we try to fix this mess, I'll be pushing to ensure that the Redlands gets our fair share. I'll be fighting to secure funding to extend Brisbane's metro system from Carindale past the Sleeman Sports Centre and through to the Redlands. Not only will this infrastructure be essential for the fortnight of competition, it will also contribute to better connecting Redlanders with the amenities and employment opportunities of Brisbane City. As the Redlands grow, this project will be essential to maintaining the quality of life for our residents. With cricket appearing in the 2032 Games, government investment in the Redlands can make the tournament one to remember. Peter Burge Oval in Wellington Point, where I'll be this Saturday for the start of the local 2020 competition, could easily play host to some of the 2020s in the tournament if we can secure the necessary investment at that venue. There's also been some discussion of having a Surf Ironman as part of the 32 program. What better place to host it than at North Stradbroke Island? I'll be working to ensure our island is well positioned to stake a claim to that iconic Olympic debut. With so many local athletes excelling in Paris, exciting times are ahead as we look forward to the Games in Queensland in 2032. I trust that, unlike Paris, our opening ceremony will showcase the best of our local culture in a way that unites us rather than divides us. I look forward to the generational opportunity to showcase the best of South East Queensland, to secure new investment for our communities and to win more gold medals for Australia.
I call the member for Bain.
Deputy Speaker, last year I participated in a 142-kilometre walk around Canberra over 5 days with an amazing group of Canberrans to raise awareness about and support Men's Link, and we're starting to prepare for this year's walk. Men's Link is a great Canberra organisation based in Bean, helping young guys going through challenging times through free counselling, volunteer mentoring and education programs. Over 20 years, they've helped thousands of boys and young men through tough or lonely times. Men's Link's programs help improve mental fitness, combat domestic violence, reduce youth suicide, increase respect and positive behaviours, and help create stronger communities. They work well with our school communities. More than 25 community, public and private sector leaders participated last year, raising over $300,000. And this year, 35 walkers have registered to walk this November. I'll be walking with Sarah Hardy from Isla and Gray Financial Advice, Pete Russell from International SOS, Jim Bokell from Blue Ridge, Ben Henderson from PCI Sports and Capital Chemists, Kane Piper from Jayco Canberra, Al Croston from Jude Digital, Susie Hoytink from HTNK Advisory, Lachlan Exton from High Road, Michael Houle from Approach Consulting, Pierre Hooter from Purdon Consulting, Michael Badnelli, the Men's Link Chair, Jess Peel from Bravehearts, Andy Friend from Performance Friend, Ben Gathercole, the Men's Link CEO, Steph Bates from Charter Tech, Bianya Cray from Southside Physio, Todd Wright from Three Sides Marketing, Alex Hoytink from HTNK Advisory, Paul Eccles from PSC Insurance Brokers, Alex Brennan from Blue Inc, Gareth Halverson from Civian Property Group, Michael O'Grady from Foresight, Anthony Simpson from BAL Lawyers, Fabian Muscat from Elite Heating and Cooling, Emily Schumark from SHD Lawyers, Ray Johnson from ACT Corrections, Anthony Hill from the Vikings Group, Dan Horcroft from the Property Collective, Julie Dobinson from DDCS Lawyers, Craig Davis and Aaron Curl from the Pass Foundation, Scott Alexander from 35 South, Sarah Darcy and Hugo Anderson from PwC, and Jeremy Archer from Working Gear. Thank you to the Menslink crew that organised and ran the walk last year alongside their day-to-day work and are assisting with our preparations this year. And thank you to all those who are taking their time to participate. It's easy for all of us to be time poor, but it's a great walk for a great cause. You can contribute via www.menslinkgreatwalk.com.au, and if you're up for a walk, give me a call.
The time, in accordance with Standing Order 193, the time for members' constituency statements has concluded, and I call the clerk.
Government Business Order of the Day number 1. Taxation, Multinational Global and Domestic Minimum Tax Bill 2024. Resumption of debate on the second reading and on the amendment moved by Mr Taylor.
Before the debate is resumed on this bill, I advise the Federation Chamber that in the House it has been agreed that a general debate be allowed covering this bill. The Taxation, Multinational Global and Domestic Minimum Tax Imposition Bill 2024 and the Treasury Laws Amendment Multinational Global and Domestic Minimum Tax Consequential Bill 2024. The original question that this bill be now read a second time. To this, the Honourable Member for Hume has moved as an amendment that all words after that be omitted with a view to substituting other words. The question is that the amendment be agreed to, and I call the member for Hawke.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. The challenge of taxing multinationals is not unique to Australia. It's a global issue that requires a coordinated international response. The rise of the digital economy, the increasing mobility of capital, and the complex nature of multinational enterprises have outpaced the capacity of traditional tax systems. As a result, governments around the world have found themselves grappling with how to ensure that large corporations do pay their fair share of tax. I'm very proud to say that Australia has been at the forefront of these international efforts. As part of our 2023-24 budget, we announced that Australia would join a group of first movers to implement both a global minimum tax and a domestic minimum tax of 15%. Applicable to multinational enterprises with an annual global revenue of approximately $1.2 billion or more, this tax will ensure that large multinational corporations pay a minimum level of tax on income generated in each jurisdiction where they operate. By cooperating with our international partners to set a floor on corporate tax rates, the Albanese Labor government is reducing the incentive for multinationals to engage in aggressive tax planning and profit shifting. This will not only protect Australia's corporate tax base, but also make our country a more attractive place to invest. In a world where capital is increasingly mobile, having a stable and predictable global tax environment is crucial for attracting long-term investment and fostering economic growth. In addition to a global minimum tax, this legislation also implements a domestic minimum tax, which will give Australia additional taxing rights on the low-taxed Australian income of large multinational groups. This is a critical safeguard to ensure that Australia collects revenue from local, undertaxed profits. This is not just about protecting our revenue base, it is also about fairness. It's about ensuring that all businesses, whether large or small, domestic or multinational, contribute their fair share to the society from which they benefit. It's about creating a level playing field where businesses compete on the basis of innovation, efficiency and service, not on their ability to exploit loopholes in a tax system. Deputy Speaker, these measures form just one component of the Albanese Labor government's strong agenda on multinational tax avoidance. We understand that such a complex issue cannot be tackled with just a single piece of legislation. That's why we have already delivered 4 separate multinational tax reforms, with a further 5 to come, alongside the global and domestic minimum taxes. One of the key reforms we've already delivered focuses on increasing transparency around corporate structures and tax arrangements. Multinational corporations often operate through a complex web of subsidiaries and affiliates, making it difficult for tax authorities to track where profits are being generated and where they are being taxed. To address this issue, the Albanese government has introduced a new subsidiary disclosure law that requires public companies to disclose information on the number of their subsidiaries and their country of tax residency. This will shine a light on how companies structure their subsidiaries, including specifically for tax purposes, and will increase transparency on corporate structures and whether they are operating with opaque tax arrangements. This reform is a significant step in our efforts to combat tax avoidance. By requiring companies to disclose this information, we are providing tax authorities with the tools they need to identify aggressive tax planning strategies and ensure that companies are paying their fair share of tax. At the same time, we're sending a clear message to multinationals that they must operate with transparency and accountability if they wish to do business here in Australia. But transparency alone is not enough. We must also ensure that companies benefiting from government contracts are contributing their fair share of tax. That's why, as part of the Albanese Labor government's Buy Australia plan, we've implemented the Fair Go procurement framework. This framework requires companies tendering for government contracts valued above $200,000 to disclose their country of tax residency. The Fair Go procurement framework is about ensuring that taxpayer dollars are spent on companies that are good corporate citizens. Companies that benefit from government contracts have a responsibility to contribute to the public purse, and this framework ensures that they are meeting that responsibility. It's a remarkably simple principle. If you want to do business with the Australian government, you must pay your fair share of tax. Deputy Speaker, as part of our broader multinational tax integrity agenda, we are also progressing legislation to create a public country-by-country reporting register. This register will require certain large multinationals to disclose their tax affairs on a country-by-country basis, providing greater transparency as to where they are paying tax and where they are generating profits. In addition to country-by-country reporting, we are also implementing a public register of beneficial ownership. This will require companies to disclose who ultimately owns or controls them, providing further transparency and making it harder for individuals to hide their wealth through complex corporate structures. This reform is a critical tool in the fight against tax evasion, money laundering, and other forms of financial crime. By shining a light on who owns and controls companies, we're making it harder for individuals to hide their assets and evade their tax responsibilities. This is about ensuring that everyone, regardless of their wealth or status, pays their fair share of tax here in Australia. Deputy Speaker, one of the most common strategies used by multinationals to minimise their tax liabilities is thin capitalisation, where companies artificially inflate their interest expenses through related party debt. This reduces their taxable income here in Australia, allowing them to shift their profits offshore. To address this, we've tightened Australia's thin capitalisation rules, reducing the ability of multinationals to engage in this practice. These reforms will ensure that interest deductions are more closely aligned with the economic substance of the debt, and that multinationals are not able to exploit the system to avoid paying their fair share of tax. Furthermore, as part of our multinational tax integrity agenda, the Albanese Labor government is introducing a new royalty penalty for significant global entities that avoid Australian royalty withholding tax. This penalty will ensure that large multinationals cannot avoid their tax obligations by understating the value of royalty payments or disguising them as some other kind of transaction. Deputy Speaker, the fight against tax avoidance not only requires strong laws, but also remarkably strong enforcement. That's why the Albanese Labor government has increased funding for the ATO's Tax Avoidance Task Force, extending its operation and increasing its resources to crack down on tax dodging by multinational enterprises, large Australian public and private groups, and extremely wealthy individuals. Since its inception, the Tax Avoidance Task Force has been instrumental in detecting and deterring tax avoidance. It's generated billions of dollars in additional revenue and has sent a strong message to those who seek to evade their tax responsibilities. By providing the ATO with the resources it needs, we're ensuring that the task force can continue its vital work and that those who try to cheat the system are held to account. Deputy Speaker, the economic impact of these reforms cannot be overstated. Economists estimate that close to 40% of multinational profits, which is roughly equivalent to around $900 billion, are shifted to low-tax countries each and every year. This has a devastating impact on the revenue base of countries like ours, where corporate tax comprises a significant portion of our total revenue. The OECD estimates that by making multinationals pay a minimum effective tax rate of 15%, annual global revenue gains could exceed $300 billion. For Australia, the benefits of these reforms are crystal clear. By ensuring that multinationals pay their fair share of tax, we're protecting our revenue base, levelling the playing field for Australian businesses, and ensuring that the benefits of economic activity in Australia are shared more broadly with the Australian people. At the same time, we're positioning Australia as a leader in global tax reform and setting a new standard for transparency, fairness and accountability in the international tax system. I commend the bill to the House.
Thank you. The question is that the amendment be agreed to, and I call the member for Riverina.
There are some aspects of the member for Hawke's speech which I earnestly agree with, and if you do business in Australia, you do business with the Australian government, yes, you should pay your fair share of tax. There's no question about that, and for many multinational entities operating, of course, in the global village in which the world is today, as long as they've got a big team of accountants and lawyers and smart financial people, they have been able to, unfortunately, avoid paying the tax that they should. And this is of concern. We as a coalition welcome the continuation of the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development's two-pillar solution to the multinational tax avoidance. This was started by the coalition. It's been continued by the government. We are very much committed to the two-pillar solution in October 2021. This commitment was based on securing an exemption for all resources and financial services companies from the framework so Australia's tax base would not be eroded, and very much the landmark agreement to secure such negotiations and such considerations and outcomes was championed by former Coalition Finance Minister, Senator Matthias Cormann, in his role as OECD Secretary-General, and he began that particular position in June of 2021. We took extensive action over 9 years of government between 2013 and 2022 to address multinational tax avoidance. As the G20 host in 2014, Australia played a leading role in the original project to ensure that there was very much a clampdown on multinational enterprises and entities doing what they've done, had done previously for many years, and that is avoid tax. I mean, every business, I know I've run a small business. I mean, the object of a business is to earn money, employ people.
A division has been called for in the House. The proceedings are suspended to enable honourable members to attend the division. The proceedings will resume when the Chair of the Federation Chamber is resumed at the conclusion of the division or subsequent divisions. The member for Riverina in continuation.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. When you run a business, it's not only your job to continue that business's success, because if you don't, you then end up having to qualify to ASIC other entities why you're running a business at a loss, and you can't do that beyond 3 successive years. But the object, of course, is to minimise tax, but in the right and proper way, the legal way. And as I said before, to employ people to provide a good or a service, and almost all Australian companies do just that. But multinational entities, because of the swathe of financial advisors and lawyers and others they have made an art in not only minimising tax but avoiding tax. And when you avoid tax, what you're doing is you are stopping those vital funds going to governments at various levels to pay for roads, hospitals, schools. You avoid paying your fair share. And I can remember when I was in business, the more GST I paid, the better I knew our company was going, because we were getting those receipts in, and when you get receipts in, tax receipts go out. And you do feel a sense of pride because you're employing people, you're providing a good or a service, you're actually contributing to the wealth of the nation, the common wealth, and that is the right thing to do. As I said, the Coalition took extensive action in our 3 terms to ensure that we addressed multinational tax avoidance. We did. Much to the mirth of those opposite, but they all weren't here, and I know I was the Deputy Prime Minister at the time, and I know the work that Senator Cormann, as I mentioned previously, that successive treasurers, including Frydenberg, Morrison before him, played in making sure that we address this issue not only at home but also abroad in the various fora around the world, such as G20, to crack down on multinationals who wanted to avoid paying tax at all, shifting money from Australia elsewhere, and the like. Under the Coalition, Australia was an early and vigilant adopter of the OECD G20 base erosion and profit shifting recommendations, and these provisions establish a multilateral approach to prevent tax avoidance and increase tax transparency to tax administrators. And it's a big job. It's a massive job, particularly when you've got overseas entities, huge companies coming in and with their various tax avoidance measures. And I know the Greens, they'd want they're anti-business Greens and their policies. If they had their way, goodness knows what a mess our financial system would be in. But they're very anti-big business, and you have to be pro-business, whether it's international, large, medium, or small. And that's a government's objective, is to create the environment around which businesses can not just survive but thrive. I have to say, disappointed at some of the reckless policies brought in by the Labor government, which has, I believe, been anti-business. But it's not just myself. I talk to any number of chambers of commerce. I talk to business people who run large companies and small, and they are concerned as well about the business environment in which Australia operates, which the Labor government has overseen. I was very interested to see the member for Chifley, the Industry Minister no less, talk about lowering the corporate tax rate. He was quickly brought to heel and reprogrammed, but when the Treasurer didn't necessarily agree with his philosophy on providing a fairer corporate tax rate. I was proud when I was the Small Business Minister, following on from the good work by the former member for Higgins, Kelly O'Dwyer, and no less than Bruce Bilson, who is now the Australian Small Business and Family Enterprise Ombudsman. But whilst I was the Minister, in that important portfolio, the tax rate for business came down to its lowest rate for around 7 decades. and I know I worked closely with former Treasurer Hockey and his successors to ensure that we did provide the framework and the landscape and the environment around which businesses could prosper. The coalition government measures included introducing the diverted profits tax that limits a company's ability to shift profits out of Australia. That's so important. Introduced the Multinational Tax Avoidance Law, which ensures companies do not avoid a taxable presence in Australia. What we also did was strengthen the thin capitalisation rules, strengthen transfer pricing rules, double the penalties for tax avoidance, and establish the ATO's Tax Avoidance Task Force. And I do commend what the Australian Taxation Office does in this space. That particular task force, which was created on the 1st of July 2016, enforces existing laws, and it supports the government of the day's new tax avoidance measures that we'd put in place, and its work continues. It targets multinational enterprises, large public and private groups, and wealthy individuals, as it should. And from the 1st of July 2016 through to the 30th of November 2021, the ATO raised, wait for this is a big figure, $24.2 billion in tax liabilities against large public groups, multinational corporations, privately owned and wealthy groups. And this generated collections of $17.3 billion. They're big figures, and that pays for a lot of the aforementioned roads and infrastructure, hospitals and schools filtering down through to the states, making sure that we have the services and amenities that we should provide Australian taxpayers and others besides, Australians who do pay their fair share, Australians who don't have the benefit of having large teams of accountants and compliance officers and legal eagles and all the like to avoid paying tax. Now, interestingly, $15.3 billion of the liabilities were raised against large public groups and multinationals, $13.6 billion of the liabilities and $9.5 billion of the collections are attributable to the task force. But our system is very much undermined when people or organisations avoid their tax obligations. And paying tax should be something that people, in one sense, have a sense of pride in, because it means that their company's making a profit. It means that what they're doing as a company is succeeding. It means that they're doing the right thing by the country, which puts the framework around them and supports them, and of course doing the right thing by their customers as well. But this legislation also highlights an important point, in that Labor has broken its promises on tax. At the last election, Labor said one of its main focuses was to be on addressing multinational tax avoidance, and I'm not quite sure that it's actually met that remit. They haven't done it right. Labor's shambolic handling of country-by-country reporting and changes to thin capitalisation, something I mentioned previously, has been shown up again and again. The Treasurer said, "We've made it very clear we don't have any proposals for tax increases beyond working with other countries to make multinationals' tax regime fairer." But I don't think they've met their obligations in that regard. But what they have done, what Labor has done, is raise taxes on superannuation. And, you know, that's something they said they'd not do. But we know that Labor likes tax. It likes jacking up tax. They are taxing unrealised capital gains. And I tell you what, if you don't believe or agree with what I'm saying, go and talk to a worried farmer. A farmer who might have a farm worth a certain amount now, and over time the value of that land increases. What Labor wants to do, what Labor has proposed to do, and is to make that farmer pay an unrealised capital gain on that farm before the farmer has even decided to sell the farm. And now, not only does that create complications for the farmer and their how they're doing their business, but also all it's doing is generating complicated work for for accountants, and it slugs the farmer unfairly because she or he has not actually sold the farm, but they're having to pay an unrealised gain. I mean, it's bonkers. It's absolute nutty policy. But we know just how uncompetitive our farmers are under Labor laws. I mean, it's an anti-agriculture government. Let's face it. Labor is increasing taxes on franking credits. Didn't work quite well for the member for Maribyrnong when he was the opposition leader and decided he would attack franking credits during the 2019 election campaign. Some might even go as far as to say it cost him the lodge. Thank goodness for that. But banking $500 million in taxes from Australian companies, Australian retirees, Australian superannuation fund and Australian charities under the guise of whacking franking credits, it's not good policy. Labor's ended small business tax concessions. It has absolutely taken the big stick to the instant asset write-off provisions. I know we had them as an unlimited amount during a COVID measure, but I tell you what, they were far better under us than they ever will be under Labor. But what Labor doesn't realise is that this is enhancing and promoting and giving small business the opportunity to buy a ute, to buy, particularly if you're a tradie or any other company, but to write off those profit-making assets, which ends up back in the tax coffers anyway. Look, this taxation measure is something that the Coalition believes is overdue. Labor needs to stop whacking everybody with its high taxes, but the bill, as I say, is something that needs to be very much looked at.
Thank you. The question is that the amendment be agreed to, and I call the member for Wills.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Across the country, Australians are struggling with the cost of living. It is a real issue that people feel every day. A lot of my constituents reaching out to my office for assistance. Since I became a member for Wills in 2016, people across my electorate have shared that their aspirations for good quality, affordable housing have become more and more out of reach. And it's a story that's reflected, I think, across Australia, and it's not new. It's an issue, I think, that has deepened by 10 years, frankly, of inaction from the previous coalition government. They inflicted immense damage on the economy and our country's fiscal position, which we've had to rectify. And as usual, it takes a Labor government to come in, begin the hard work of repairing the damage that the Abbott, the Turnbull, the Morrison years inflicted upon ordinary Australians. That's why we've delivered 2 surpluses in a row. This could not be clearer when we consider how the coalition completely abrogated its responsibility on multinational tax avoidance. For a decade, the coalition government sat on the Treasury benches and allowed the issue of tax avoidance to fester. They ignored clear advice and efforts at international collaboration that had been championed by the last Labor government, the Gillard government. The Albanese Labor government is finally delivering this action and developing a coordinated approach to address this key issue. Why? Because the Albanese government believes that a fairer tax system is better for all Australians. Now, you can't hide your profits or your revenue if you've got a local cafe in my electorate, if you're in Pascoe Vale or Brunswick, cafe owner. You're not able to hide your revenue in a subsidiary on the Cayman Islands. No cafe owner can do that. No small business person can do that. Yet, they are still paying their fair share of taxes. The average punter is paying their fair share of tax, whether it's a small business that they own or run, or whether it's their salary or their wages. They can't hide what they make from the tax man. Yet, the multinationals do and can and have. That's why the Albanese government believes in transparency and global coordination on multinational tax avoidance, because the system has been gamed internationally for too long. And this is about ensuring the profits of multinational companies are not hidden offshore, but they pay their fair share of tax that can go back into our budget and deliver the services that the Australian people need. Now, to support the government's effort to crack down on multinational tax avoidance, the government is introducing the Multinational Global and Domestic Minimum Tax Bill. This legislation delivers on the government's election commitment to ensure multinationals pay their fair share of tax by implementing a 15% global and domestic minimum tax rate. And this is it forms part of a coordinated approach across more than 130 countries to implement the OECD G20 two-pillar solution, a 2021 international agreement to address the tax challenges that have coupled the rise of the digital economy. This bill also responds to the problem of large multinational corporations seeking to reduce tax by shifting profits from Australia to low tax or no tax jurisdictions. Cayman Islands, any of these kind of jurisdictions where they can store, in a kind of artificial sense, pretend that their headquarters are there, even though they're making the profits here. Now, this effectively erodes Australia's tax base. It reduces the money that can be invested into vital services Australians rely upon every day. To respond to this challenge of profit shifting, the government announced in the 23-24 budget that we would implement a 15% global minimum tax and domestic minimum tax for multinational corporations with an annual global revenue of at least $1.2 billion. So if they're making money here, if they're making billions in revenue and profit in Australia and then pretending that their headquarters is elsewhere in a low tax jurisdiction so that they pay zero tax on the dollar out of the money that they make here, they're not going to get away with that anymore. And they got away with it for 10 years under the previous government. They sat on their hands for 10 years, decided to take no action. The previous speaker, the member for Riverina, talked about the former Treasurer Josh Frydenberg and all these great things that they did. They did nothing. Multinational corporations were making billions of dollars in this country, hundreds of millions of dollars, and paying next to no tax. Some of them paid zero tax on the dollar. Some of them were able to reduce their tax bills down to 1 or 2 cents in the dollar because their headquarters were somewhere else where they were supposed to be paying tax under that jurisdiction, which happened to be a low tax or no tax jurisdiction. It's a scam. It's a way to avoid the responsibility of paying your fair share of tax. It's a way to avoid being like the cafe owner or the ordinary Australian punter who pays 30 cents in the dollar or 25 cents in the dollar, whatever their tax bill is. They can't hide from that. Tax office follows them up. But no, these multinationals, they could just make $900 million in Australia and pay 5% or 2% because they've shifted their profits or they have a low tax base headquarter. This is an important step, and this is part of the government's broad agenda, an ambitious tax reform agenda, because when multinationals pay less, individuals and Australian small businesses pay more. And it's not fair. It's actually not fair. It's unfair. Fundamentally, billions of dollars in taxes that should be paid here in Australia have not for decades. And under the former government, they got away with billions of dollars of unpaid tax. It could have gone into schools. It could have gone into hospitals. It could have gone into roads. It could have gone into public transport. It could have gone into mental health. It could have gone into so many things that make a difference to people's lives, and yet they allowed the profits to just wander off to the Cayman Islands or wherever it was, and no tax was paid here, even though they made money here in Australia. So we need to ensure, and that's what we're doing, that these multinationals pay their fair share and invest in the services that our communities need. It's also an important step forward in ending the race to the bottom on global corporate tax rates. By ensuring that multinationals pay their fair share around the world, we are securing Australia's tax base so we can support Australians, their services and small businesses, and make our economy more competitive. And this required a commitment, a diplomatic effort, and engagement with other countries, which we have taken as a government. We've taken that step. I mean, the last leap forward on transparency and global cooperation in taxation was introduced back in 2012 by the Gillard government. Then we had Sleepy Hollow for 10 years under the coalition. They did nothing. The previous speakers talk about a couple of little peripheral changes here and there. They did something on thin capitalisation, did this, that. Guess what? Tens of billions of dollars, probably a lot more, did not go into the Australian budget because you did nothing, or the opposition, now the opposition, then the government, did nothing about it. There's been 10 years of inaction and inertia. Between 2013 and 2022, while leaders across the globe bolstered efforts at international cooperation, what did the coalition government do? It turned away and sat on its hands. There were mounting calls for international coordination in the wake of the first Panama Papers, then the Lux Leaks, then the Paradise Papers, all revealing widespread and sophisticated efforts by individuals to avoid tax. And still the coalition failed to act. And this was despite warnings that this challenge from everyone, from every organisation, the IMF, the President of the World Bank. And the first thing that the coalition did when they came into government back then, after the Gillard government, you know what they did? What was the first thing they did? Not try and engage in tackling this problem, Deputy Speaker. They sacked 4,700 ATO workers. Oh, that's going to help. Let's just completely denude the very people that we need to work on this problem. And then you've got the former Treasurer Joe Hockey's pledge to end the age of entitlement. Guess what? It was actually accelerated. The age of entitlement was accelerated for the big corporates, for the big multinationals. The research shows, and I alluded to this earlier, Deputy Speaker, how many billions of dollars went begging? How many billions of dollars that should have gone into the Australian people, to the Australian people, through services through the Australian government providing them, how many went offshore? How many billions? Does anyone know? I hear the member here says a lot. I'll tell you, Deputy Speaker, it was around, the estimates are around nearly $600 billion in profits that were shifted into tax havens, just in that period of time. 600 billion. What do you reckon we could have done with that as a government, as a nation, to address inequality, to address the needs of the Australian community? Quite a lot, actually. That's accurate. What they did when they were in government, Deputy Speaker, was to allow these multinationals to lean on the loopholes in our tax system while ordinary Australians were forced to lift the heavy burden. Your mum and your dad, small business owner, your punter down there who's working at Woolies and paying their taxes, your salary earner, your wage earner, they were doing the heavy lifting, while the big multinationals just flew out like a big dragon with their booty and their loot and deposited it over in their low-tax, no-tax haven on some island in the Caribbean. And they stood by and watched that happen. No, they helped them. They facilitated it. They didn't care. So despite the pitiful efforts, or lack of effort, that was made by the coalition to take this problem seriously, to actually do something about it, to make a difference, it's taken us, the Albanese Labor government, to deliver on the international best practice to ensure a fairer and more transparent tax system. This legislation is going to be peer-reviewed. Advice will be given to the OECD to ensure it is consistent with other jurisdictions to end that race to the bottom. Implementing this global minimum corporate tax will also allow the government to apply a top-up tax on large multinationals operating in Australia where their overseas income is taxed at lower than 15% rate. Implementing a domestic minimum tax complements the global minimum tax and ensures that Australia, rather than other jurisdictions, collects revenue from locals under taxation. By making multinationals pay a minimum effective tax rate of 15%, the OECD estimates annual global revenue gains of over $300 billion. So Australia, under the Albanese government, is joining other countries, the UK, Canada, Japan, South Korea, the EU, and other jurisdictions in implementing this global minimum tax from 2024. But that's just one part of Labor's larger plan when it comes to the tax system. The government has also delivered enhanced public scrutiny on tax information, which will give the Parliament and the public better information about the amounts of tax multinationals are paying in Australia. So we can see, providing that transparency is at the heart of our tax reform. And under this government, public companies, listed and unlisted, will now be required to disclose information on the number of their subsidiaries and their country of tax domicile. This will increase transparency on their corporate structures and whether they are operating with opaque tax arrangements. Flush that out, Deputy Speaker. It's about holding companies to account on their corporate structures. Some do the right thing, but for too long, as I said, under the previous government, many of them made off with the booty to their low tax or no tax havens, and that's unacceptable. The government's also introduced legislation to bolster country-by-country reporting to ensure deeper cooperation on an international issue and deliver greater accountability to those multinationals. And in addition, the Albanese government has strengthened the funding for the ATO's tax avoidance task force by $200 million a year over 4 years. This is another aspect of how the government's transparency agenda will deliver greater accountability. And it's backed up with real action and increased funding so the ATO has the resources it needs to deliver on the government's agenda. Deputy Speaker, multilateral taxation coordination is not exactly a phrase that usually makes the front pages of the paper, depending on your choice of reading. But it is an issue that I have been personally and professionally involved with for many, many years, because it was fundamentally unfair what was happening. The billions of dollars that could have gone to services for the Australian people because those multinationals were not paying their tax, their fair share. And I worked on these policy issues when we were in opposition, and the policy work that, the great work that Jim Chalmers, the now Treasurer, and the Assistant Treasurer, Andrew Lee, worked on. And we're delivering now in government. That's what governments do, deliver and make a difference. And in this place, we care about the real-world implications of these policies. So we know that hard-working businesses, like I mentioned in my community, you know, whether it's in Fawkner or Hatfield or Oak Park, a cafe owner who pays their fair share knows that there's going to be real transparency and accountability, and the multinationals will not get away with not paying their fair share because they work hard. They've got the blood, the sweat and the tears that they put into their small business or their work that they do. And it's about ensuring that they don't pick up the slack left by multinationals and their armies of accountants who shift profits to tax havens overseas, that there's fairness in the system. That's why this government is committed to being a leader on the international stage when it comes to multinational tax avoidance and minimum rates of global tax. That's what we're doing, and we will not allow this issue to be kicked into the long grass.
The question is that the amendment be agreed to, and I call the member for Mallee.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. This package of multinational tax avoidance measures builds on the world-class, world-first legislation the Coalition developed when we were in government. Despite what the member for Wills says, for a long time, multinational companies avoided paying tax in some countries using tax havens or favourable regimes, depriving countries like Australia of much-needed tax revenue. Today, I will highlight some glaring examples where multinational companies have ruined Australian businesses. A rapidly growing share of shopping and trade now occurs through a multinational company's online platform or business. When a multinational company avoids paying their fair share of tax, Australian families and small businesses are forced to carry the burden. The Coalition acted on this important initiative in 2014, where we found that existing laws were insufficient to address the cunning tax avoidance strategies multinational companies employ. During Australia's presidency of the G20 in 2014, the then Coalition government introduced some of the strongest tax integrity rules in the world. The OECD's Base Erosion and Profit Shifting Action Plan followed suit, and that's important because a globally coordinated effort is required. Without it, multinational companies will shift their business or activity to tax havens or countries like the Cayman Islands. Since 2021, more than 140 countries have signed an agreement led by the OECD to impose at least 15% corporate tax. The OECD estimates that if everyone signed up, tax avoidance would reduce by 80% worldwide. Identifying where companies earn their money is difficult in an increasing online marketplace, and particularly when it concerns the tech giants whom I will focus on today. Facebook, now called Meta, claim they pay 30% corporate income tax. However, that's on what they report to be Australian revenue. Facebook paid just over $30 million in Australia in tax in the most recent available reporting year, 21-22. Just 2.6% of their Australian annual revenues of $1.15 billion in the last reporting year. They claim 91% of their income was not taxable. Google earned $1.892 billion in Australian revenues but paid just $90 million in tax, an effective tax rate of 4.8%, claiming 80% of their revenue isn't taxable. Microsoft was worse, earning $6.3 billion in revenue in Australia, but claiming 93.6% of its revenue was not taxable, nothing to see here, resulting in them paying just $120 million, or effectively 1.9% effective tax on gross profits. Deputy Speaker, believe it or not, there is a worse offender, Apple, who earned $9.3 billion on Australian shores, yet paid just $137.3 million in tax, which was only 1.5% of their Australian revenues. Appallingly, in 2018, Netflix reportedly had an effective tax rate of 0.05% in Australia, despite $1 billion in revenue, paying just $342,000 in tax. That figure rose to $868,000 in 2022, but is still far short of its revenue and impact on Australian society. Netflix's tax avoidance smarts aren't limited to Australia. And in the USA, during the life of the Trump administration, Netflix paid $81 million US in corporate tax despite earning $10.5 billion over that period. How do they get away with this? Into that multinational tax avoidance mix comes this package of bills to implement the global minimum 15% tax in concert with the other 140 inclusive framework member countries as part of the two-pillar solution on multinational tax avoidance. The package has been delayed by some reluctance from the United States, from both the Obama and Trump administrations, because many of the targets of anti-avoidance by multinational corporations have been some of America's biggest companies. The government estimates this package of bills will bring in just over $370 million over the 5 years ending 26-27. I want to focus in this context on the lack of social responsibility portrayed by the tech giants in our society and economy. First of all, there is a shocking level of scams through social media, Google and the internet. In my electorate of Mallee, constituents have come to me dismayed at being scammed. In fact, I've been scammed myself recently. While the government is taking some action in this area, I would like to see strong action to prevent vulnerable people from being exploited by scammers. On the weekend, Westpac accused Meta of failing to deal with the scam and fraud epidemic, raising 360 scam incidents from October to this month for Westpac customers alone. Executive Carolyn McCann urged Meta to review the way the Facebook platform is being used to scam ordinary Australians. The tech giants are also facilitating significant economic harm in our communities. Amazon, Google and Meta, through Facebook Marketplace, are becoming go-to destinations for people buying and selling new or second-hand goods. Meanwhile, local small businesses with retail leases are under huge pressure. In the media space, the tech giants' ability to target Australians on the phones they look at, on average 7.8 times an hour, according to Tech Daily, which equates to about 4 to 5 hours a day looking at their phone. Data out this week shows teens are spending 2 hours a day looking at TikTok, an hour and a half on Snapchat, and an hour on Google-owned YouTube, while children aged 10 to 12 spend 79 minutes a day on YouTube and 122 minutes, 2 hours, on TikTok. Apart from these deeply disturbing statistics, the tech giants are also killing traditional forms of advertising. Streaming services like Netflix that I mentioned earlier have slashed free-to-air television viewership, forcing Australian television networks to speed up the rollout of their digital television on-demand services. Advertising revenue on Australian digital on-demand services is rising, but not fast enough to keep up with the lost revenue on traditional free-to-air services. Teenage television viewership has reportedly fallen from 75 minutes a day in 2011 to just 13 minutes, according to Free TV. Live streaming is now 20% of all free-to-air viewing, and that number is rising. Many new homes do not even bother installing an aerial. I've given this subject a lot more thought recently because on the 1st of July, Mildura suffered the indignity of reportedly the first shutdown of digital television service in Australia. Former Communications Minister Stephen Conroy visited Mildura back in July 2010, hailing Mildura as the first place in Australia to switch on digital television. Of course, this was a positive spin put on switching off analogue television signal. Now Mildura is arguably the first to lose digital signal too. Mildura already lost its local television journalists and does not have a local television news bulletin. We used to have a healthy local journalism market. Now all our television news comes out of Melbourne, or if you're lucky, Ballarat and Bendigo. I cannot speak to a local Win 7 or 10 journalist with their camera. I've had to beam in via satellite on my own device. Without local journalists, TV networks just ignore local stories. Mildura people put up with the homogenised news from other parts of a very wide, disconnected region due to the death of local journalism. Local radio and newspapers are struggling as well, and as non-government broadcasters, they rely on advertising revenue. They are rapidly failing due to the tech giants monstering the advertising industry. Lest anyone is thinking it, I will briefly mention the ABC is not the solution here. The solution to market failure is not more government-controlled journalism. Rather, it is to find ways to improve competition. Media competition is dying in regional Australia, and the traditional Australian media and the tax-avoiding tech giants are the ones silencing our local voices. The Coalition led the world again in government when we created a news bargaining code, but under this government, the multinational digital platforms have refused to renew the deals. These deals were estimated to be worth $200 million per annum to fund Australian journalism, a fraction of what these multinationals should be paying in tax in Australia. Australian media companies face all the other rising costs of doing business, but compete on an unbalanced playing field against tech giants that pay nowhere near the 25% corporate income tax for businesses with turnovers under $50 million, or 30% for businesses with higher turnovers. The Coalition lowered corporate tax rates from 30% for all businesses to 25%. We wanted to lower it for all businesses, but settled on lower taxes for businesses with turnover under $50 million. The lower corporate tax rate encourages investment and discourages the use of tax havens. Even the Minister for Science knows that. According to the US Tax Foundation, the average corporate tax rate around the world is lower than ours at 23.45% and 23.73% in the OECD. In Asia, the average is 19.8%, the lowest regional corporate tax rate in the world. There are only 20 jurisdictions in the world with a higher corporate tax rate than Australia for companies with over $50 million per turnover per annum. Little wonder the tech giants look for tax havens to escape our corporate tax. And let's not forget, these tax-avoiding tech giants are also failing our children and vulnerable people in the community by failing to take appropriate action against predators, scammers, sextortionists, pornography, violent or extremist material online. The Coalition put forward the proposal for age verification online, but this government have very slowly moved towards a trial in this area. We know from overseas examples that age verification works, and for reasons I'm outlining in this speech, the tax-avoiding tech giants' complaints about how hard age verification is should fall on deaf ears in Australia. The tech giants are acting in a socially irresponsible way in Australia and do not pay their fair share of tax, so they can lift their game on age verification. I'm very concerned about the growing foreign influence of the tech giants because Australians are spending so many hours of their day on these tech giants' platforms. with their thoughts being directed by foreign influences, not our own. Australians are shown political content from, say, the United States in precedence to Australian politics. I believe our political literacy in Australia is at an all-time low. Social media algorithms give users more of what they are already looking at or talking about, thanks to the corporate surveillance of your own phone, to reinforce existing biases. At least traditional media services once showed both sides of a story, gave you a diverse, informative news bulletin on the 6 or 7 o'clock news to broaden your intellectual horizons. It gets worse, Deputy Speaker. We parliamentarians are expected to spend money on these tax-avoiding tech giant platforms, promoting what we have to say to ensure our voters are seeing it. Who profits from that? The same multinational tech giants that are paying less than 5% effective tax in Australia. We are rewarding their conquest of the entertainment and news market by paying them to gain even more market share. In conclusion, Deputy Speaker, this bill builds on the Coalition's world leadership of acting in the Australian national interest, and I believe the current government must do more. The tax-avoiding multinationals do not have Australia's best interests at heart, and we need the federal government to stand up to them.
The question is that the amendment be agreed to, and I call the member for Griffith.
Thanks, Deputy Speaker. You would think, in the context of one of the worst housing and cost of living crises we have seen in generations, that everyone in this country would be doing it tough. But there are one group who are actually doing very well right now, and those are large coal, oil, gas and large multinational corporations who are driving this cost of living and housing crisis with their massive price gouging and huge super corporate profits. We know that over 30% of the entire Australian economy goes to the profits of big corporations. We know that as a result of analysis of this cost of living crisis, over the last few years, Australia's 500 Australian companies made $98 billion in crisis profits. That includes Woolworths and NAB, one of the big 4 Australian banks. So while you're paying more at the supermarket, getting price gouged, paying massive amounts on your mortgage and being forced into vicious financial stress, some of Australia's largest corporations are getting away with massive super corporate profits. Now, why is this happening? Well, in part, and in large part, because those same corporations, whether it be Santos, Chevron, NAB, the big 4 banks, who happen now to be represented, by the way, by former Labor Premier Anna Bligh, well, they wield enormous power over our political system, both sides of politics, both Labor and the Liberals. We know, by the way, that they both take millions of dollars in donations from those same corporations who benefit from incredibly favourable tax arrangements that, for instance, in one financial year saw for every coal and gas corporation operating in this country, 3 out of 5 of them paid $0 in tax. None. Exporting our coal, oil and gas overseas. That means that $100 billion in income across 54 companies saw them pay $0 in tax. In fact, if you take together in the 10 years between 2014 and 2024, all the teachers in the country paid twice as much tax as the entire oil and gas sector. This is despite the fact that Australia is one of the largest exporters of oil and gas and coal and fossil fuels in the world. We're in the top 3. In the top 3. And despite that, we are in a situation where millions of people are living in poverty in this country, where you've got single mums choosing between feeding their kids and paying the rent, where you have families coming to free meal programs who are on a mortgage because they can't afford to feed their family every night just so they can cover a mortgage that goes to one of the big 4 banks that records massive corporate profits, that then they get away with paying very little tax on that compared to the amount of income that they make, that then means the government decides not to invest in the cost of living relief that those people need. Now, what we know is even if we just taxed our fossil fuel industry the same rate as we taxed as Norway taxed their oil and gas industry, we would raise hundreds of billions of dollars more in income that we could put towards real cost of living relief. And it's worth thinking about it in these terms. Every time you have to skip seeing the dentist because you can't afford to pay, Well, that's in part because this government and governments will not properly tax our multinational corporations, who 1/3 of them get away with paying $0 in tax, or tax our oil and gas industry. And that means there's not the revenue there to bring in dental and mental health into Medicare. Every time you're struggling to pay your student debt and it is weighing down on you and preventing you from getting a home loan, well, that's because this government and both sides of politics have decided they'd rather large multinational corporations and coal, oil and gas corporations pay sometimes $0 in tax than they would in providing you with relief and wiping your student debt and making university free. If you're a pensioner or an income support, every time you're forced into poverty because the cost of living goes up faster than your income support payments and you're forced to live on poverty payments, and if you're a renter, cop massive rent increases that you can't cover, that's because both sides of politics, Labor and the Liberals, decide that they would rather multinational corporations and the big oil and gas corporations pay very little in tax, sometimes $0 in tax. We know, for instance, that the government's latest gas tax, well, it was revealed that in the room when that was being drafted sat some of Australia's largest coal, oil and gas executives. Now, you don't get to see ordinary working people sit in the room with senior officials and write tax policy, but you do get to see large multinational corporations and their executives have enormous influence over our political system. But here's the bottom line. Australia is an incredibly wealthy country, but right now an overwhelming amount of that wealth and power is concentrated in the hands of a small few. But if we did properly tax our coal, oil and gas industry, if we did properly tax multinational corporations, we could bring dental and mental health into Medicare. We could scrap HECS debt and make university free again. We could bring the pension and income supports above the poverty line. We could invest in a government builder and developer that goes and builds hundreds of thousands of good quality homes that are sold and rented at prices people can actually afford, just like this country used to do and countries around the world do right now. Politics is about choices, and right now, both major parties have decided to choose poverty and immiseration and suffering in some cases, and millions in poverty. They've decided to choose that over properly taxing multinational corporations. And the reality is that the only way we're going to stop this is with a people-powered movement that wields more power over the major parties than the coal, oil and gas industry does over those political systems. We know that former Labor and Liberal MPs have gone on to work to lobby for the coal, oil and gas industry. We know that the former Labor Premier, Anna Bligh, is now the head of the Australian Banking Association. We know the power these corporations wield, and the only way we're going to push back is with the movement more powerful than them. And when Labor and the Liberal Party realise that people are sick of being taken for granted by a political establishment that far too often chooses their poverty and immiseration and chooses to leave them in that than overtaxing big multinational corporations.
The question is that the amendment be agreed to, and I call the member for Wentworth.
Deputy Speaker, the tax system is the backbone of the Australian economy, supporting economic activity and funding government and essential services. But the tax system is not static. It needs frequent tinkering and occasional large-scale reform to ensure it is fit for purpose and meeting the objectives for which it serves society. This amendment, while likely to go unnoticed by many outside this building, is an important change. Since 1970, economists estimate that the corporate tax loss from global profit shifting increased from 0.1% of corporate tax revenues in the 1970s to 10% in 2019. In Australia, around 1 in 3 large public companies pay no tax in Australia, with revenue shifting costing the budget around $5 billion each year. In an increasingly globalised world, it is essential that Australia is not robbed of its prosperity by multinationals using accounting tricks and low tax jurisdictions to undermine our tax system. This bill will implement Pillar 2 of the OECD model rules to impose minimum tax rates of at least 15% on multinational entities, as agreed by 139 countries back in 2019. It will create less incentive for profit shifting and is expected to increase Australia's annual tax intake modestly. And while this is an important piece of legislation, I want to take this opportunity to outline the importance of large-scale tax reform and the growing momentum for change that I'm experiencing as I conduct community consultation for my tax green paper. Over the past actually 18 months, I've been speaking to economists, to business leaders, to environmental groups, to the social and community sector about the need for tax reform. And there is actually a broad-scale agreement about that need and about that the tax system needs to be set up for the future. As Ken Henry said, has said in a number of cases, we are facing an intergenerational tragedy where young people today face both the burden of paying for climate change and the adaptation and mitigation that has been caused by previous generations, carrying the burden of hundreds of billions of dollars worth of debt and structural deficits as far as the eye can see, and face the burden of also dealing with a tax system that is strongly targeted to income earners. Now, in a time where the population is ageing and resources are particularly going to our ageing population, this is a real challenge for young workers who will, if we retain our current tax system, take on more and more of that burden. And at the same time, because we have a low productivity environment at the moment and because we're not building and innovating in our business environment as much as we need to, we have another challenge in our tax system, which is significantly about those business challenges as well. And those are some of the reasons, certainly, why the economists, the people in the business community, people in the environmental community care about tax, because they care about the long-term prosperity of our country, they care about intergenerational fairness, and they care about ensuring that we are doing everything we can to make this transition as cheap and as effective and as quick as possible, and tax plays into that. But it's not just the experts, it's not just the economists, it's not just the business groups who see this. It's actually the community who sees this too. Over the past month, I've been conducting an online survey of my constituents in Wentworth to try and understand what are the community's views on tax reform. Our office has been inundated with over 1,000, almost 1,000 responses, and I have been impressed by the thoughtfulness and understanding of the tax system that is evidenced through the responses. In my electorate, 75% of respondents believe that tax reform is a high priority for the government. This percentage increases to 85% for those between the ages of 25 to 34. Young people are caring about this issue. Related to the intentions of this piece of legislation, many respondents outlined their anger with the ability of large corporates, and particularly multinational companies, to shift profits. So I do believe they would support the intent of this legislation. But interestingly, the issue with the highest overall share of responses related to ensuring that revenues from the extraction of Australia's mineral resources are taxed appropriately, particularly when the prices are high, followed closely by the need to address taxes that contribute to unaffordability of housing. Among younger respondents, there is a strong sense that the tax system is broken for them, particularly around these two issues. They are appalled that activities that are harmful and destructive to Australia's natural environment seem to generate limited tax benefit for Australians. Megan says, "This country's resources belong to all of us, and mining companies should be paying us to dig up the land, take them and export them." Similarly, younger people are frustrated by settings that make it easier to buy an investment property than it does to make them buy their own home. Relatedly, Valerie highlights the disparity between income sources, saying there shouldn't be additional benefit from investing in houses versus working for income, because many people, particularly in younger generations, don't have the capital to back them to buy a home. They are just working for income, and they are concerned about the tax system's balance in this regard. But it's not just young people calling out for reform. Many older people in my electorate live comfortably and have benefited from a tax system that has allowed and encouraged them to accrue wealth through superannuation concessions or housing. They have worked hard, and I pay tribute to that. They have worked hard and innovated and contributed. But they are also worried about what our settings mean now for future generations. They're concerned that they've climbed the ladder, but that the ladders, they're pulling up the ladder behind them. 75% of people aged 55 or older also believe that tax reform is a high priority, which is consistent with the whole sample. As Chris, a man in my electorate over the age of 65, says, "Possibly the biggest problem Australia has is the growing inequality, with housing being the best example. This will lead to fractures in the stability of our society." One final point I want to touch on from this survey is the surprisingly high focus on innovation. in company in topics with such as climate change and housing affordability. I was glad to see that innovation and productivity also feature prominently, highlighting the community's frustration with the government's inaction to address Australia's flatlining productivity growth. As Suzanne puts it, the promotion of investment and innovation is great, but what is provided in tax benefits to achieve outcomes? The only increase is bureaucracy and more forms to fill. While I appreciate one electorate is not representative of the whole country, I think these results show that momentum is building for wider tax reform. Australians of all generations are increasingly seeing the connection between the challenges they face, all their children face, and their grandchildren may face, and the settings in the tax system. I welcome this bill and support the intentions of aligning global minimum tax rates to ensure that corporations pay their fair share of tax, regardless of where they're based. But more needs to be done, and done urgently, to address the other issues front of mind to Australians, for which the tax system has an important role to play. Thank you.
The question is that the amendment be agreed to, and I call the member for Wannon.
Thanks, Deputy Speaker. And it is important that multinationals pay their fair share of tax, because people paying tax, and especially multinationals paying their fair share of tax, means that we can deliver the services that we need. And we need those services more and more, and we need government, especially the federal government, to be able to provide the finances to the states so those services can be provided. I'll give you an example from my electorate. At the moment, we've just seen maternity services at the Camperdown Hospital cease. Now, my hope is that they will resume as quickly as possible, but it's a classic example whereby if you're not getting the taxes that you need, if you're not then providing the services that you need, then services will get withdrawn. And what we're seeing more and more is as pressures through cost of living and cost of doing business come onto the budget, especially in Victoria, we're seeing health services cut. And we cannot have health services cut, especially in my electorate, especially when it comes to maternity services like those in Camperdown. So let's hope that they can be reinstated as quickly as possible, because it is so important that services are delivered. And the way you deliver services is you make sure you've got equitable taxation. Now, as we've seen with multinationals over a period of time, there have been real concerns about whether we are getting multinationals paying their fair share of tax. And that's why when we were in government, when the coalition was in government, we started a process of making sure that multinationals would be taxed fairly. And as the Deputy Speaker knows, as everyone in this chamber knows, that was incredibly important work. And what we're seeing from the government here is a continuation of that process, a continuation of the OECD two-pillar solution to multinational tax avoidance. And we obviously support that work because we want to make sure that multinationals are paying their fair share, because, as I illustrated from the example before, if we're not getting everyone paying their fair share, then pressure comes onto government to be able to provide the services that they need. Now, we remember before the last election that the government, the Labor Party, then said that the only thing that they would be looking to do with regards to raising taxes was when it came to multinationals. Now, of course, we're 2 years since the election, and now we see for the first time them beginning to do something on this. Now, why it's taking them 2 years is beyond me, but that seems to be the glacial pace that this government works on anything. But they also said that's all we're going to do when it comes to taxation. And yet, once again, what we've seen is a failure to honour their word, a failure to honour their commitment. Now, let me just give you some examples of this. So they said, oh, our focus will be on multinationals, it'll be on multinationals. But what have they done as well as multinationals? They've raised taxes on superannuation. So no new taxes, won't do anything, raise taxes on superannuation. And then came a real doozy. They decided that they would tax unrealised capital gains. They're going to tax unrealised capital gains. Now, how that is going to work is, I think, beyond anyone. How the government could even introduce such a policy and then think that it would be workable is just crazy. I'll give you an example of a farmer in my electorate. Now, they might have seen their land values go up over the last 3 or 4 years, and all of a sudden, because of what's happening with agricultural prices, that land might have started to go down. Now, how is this going to work when you're trying to tax unrealised capital gains? Just say when the land value had gone up, they might have had to sell some property to pay the unrealised capital gain. All of a sudden, the price goes down. How does that going to work in this wonderful system that the government is putting in place? Obviously, we're going to have to see the detail at some stage. And as we know, especially when it comes to the Prime Minister, he's not very good at the detail. So who knows what is going to happen when it comes to that wonderful new area of taxation that they've put in place. Then, of course, there are the increases on franking credits. They said they weren't going to do anything on franking credits, but then by stealth, we see that they've introduced taxes on franking credits. And then, of course, they've ended the small business tax concessions. They've decimated the instant asset write-off relied on by Australian small businesses. So here we were, no taxing, we're only going to do it to multinationals, and then all of a sudden what we have is we've got new taxes, and those opposites start arcing up, and of course they can't arc up and say, oh no, we didn't do it. They arc up and say, oh well, even though we said we weren't going to introduce new taxes, and the fact we have introduced new taxes, there's nothing to see here. Well, the Australian people are waking up to the government, and they're waking up in a cold sweat. They're waking up in a cold sweat because all they're seeing from the government is they're making the cost of your life in every area more expensive, because they're taxing you where they can, and they're adding to your cost of living where they can, they're adding to your cost of doing business where they can. It's cost, and there is no solutions whatsoever, especially when it comes to cost of living, which is getting to the stage now where schools are having to feed children. It's getting to the stage now where small businesses are saying to me, my electorate, it's never been this bad. Asian financial crisis, GFC, was nothing on what we're dealing with now. And people, the government, people are waking up. They know when comes to their wages, their real wages have gone down. When it comes to their wages, they go to the supermarket, they can buy about a quarter or a third less of what they used to be able to buy. They get that realisation every single time they turn up to the supermarket. It is there writ large for them about what is happening to the real capacity of their wages to be able to purchase things. So I say to the government, enough with taxing. That is not what people need right now. So if you could do that, start on cost of living, deal with inflation, deal with the cost of doing business, that is what your key focus should be. So, Deputy Speaker, while we welcome the continuation of the work that we were doing in government when it comes to multinationals and making sure they pay their fair share, and I just hear an interjection, I've got to take it. Someone over there said, oh, you've been asleep at the wheel. We actually introduced this 2 years you've taken to produce this. 2 years. You haven't only been asleep at the wheel, you rolled your sleeping bag out, put some ear mufflers on and went into a coma for 2 years. You've done nothing for 2 years. You've been in government for 2 years and now you've just introduced this. I mean, it is extraordinary interjection from those opposite. I would just focus on doing your job, making life easier for the Australian people and especially fixing cost of living and cost of doing business, and you don't do that with new taxes.
The question is that the amendment be agreed to, and I call the Minister.
Well, firstly, I'd like to thank all members who've contributed to the debate. Together, this package of bills will enact a 15% global minimum tax and domestic minimum tax for multinational enterprises operating in Australia, with an annual global revenue of €750 million, which is approximately 1.2 billion Australian dollars or greater. These bills, upon receiving royal assent, will apply to fiscal years commencing on or after 1 January 2024. Large multinational enterprises with operations in Australia may therefore face a top-up tax liability under these taxes from this date if their effective tax rate is less than 15%. These bills represent a landmark achievement in the international tax landscape and follows on from the government's 2023-24 budget announcement that we would implement global and domestic minimum taxes for large multinational enterprises. Their introduction also marks further progress on the government's election commitment to support Pillar 2 of the OECD G20 two-pillar solution to addressing the tax challenges arising from the digitalisation of the economy. It also builds on the government's multinational tax integrity package to help ensure multinational enterprises pay their fair share of tax. Not only does this legislation place Australia alongside other lead jurisdictions as part of a global effort to prevent a race to the bottom on corporate tax rates, but it also offers Australia some important domestic benefits. Putting a floor on corporate income tax rates will reduce the incentive for multinational enterprises to shift profits away from Australia to low-tax jurisdictions. This will in turn improve the competitiveness of smaller domestic businesses by reducing such tax advantages available to multinational enterprises. Avoiding a race to the bottom on corporate taxes will also support investment in Australia, given our relatively high headline corporate tax rate and the relatively large share of revenue that Australia draws from corporate taxation. Importantly,
Continue.
Importantly, implementing these taxes, especially a domestic minimum tax, and having the package of bills apply from 1 January 2024 will ensure that Australia retains first claim to additional taxing rights on any low-tax domestic income, thereby protecting our revenue base. It is important to note that that the first global and domestic minimum tax returns will not be due until 30 June 2026, giving multinational enterprises time to adapt their compliance and reporting systems. Finally, these bills will not affect Australia's existing corporate income tax rate or rules, nor Australia's existing taxation integrity measures, all of which will continue to apply to multinational enterprises operating in Australia, ensuring the integrity of our tax system. In closing, I want to acknowledge the many officials that have worked on this extremely complicated package of reforms. From the International Tax Branch, Kerry Baguli, William Potts, Henry Addison, Lillian Yan, Mackenzie Brown, Brian McKay, Ming Liang Sun. From Law Division, Tanya Coit, Monica Lee, Madison Bell, Jodek Chan, Kelly Minarets, Ron Harry, Diana Batchelor, Rumbi Mori, Istiak Ahmed, Janelle Harris. From the Office of Parliamentary Counsel, Daniel Lovrick, Matthew Sight, Eric Armstrong, Jonathan Fua. And from the Australian Taxation Office, Adam Peel, Takriya Ali, Adam Reid, Alexandra McCallum, Angus Brackenreg, Brendan Wagner, Bruce Matheson, Carolyn Arman, Katina Gregory, Lakshmi Kuritswath, Louise Anafoto, Marcus Wong, Melissa Papazzo, Michael Saputo, Michael Wang, Nola B, Paul Skellett, Rhys Manley, Simon Helmers, Tim Smith. I commend these bills to the House.
The original question was that this bill be now read a second time. To this, the Honourable Member for Hume has moved as an amendment that all words after that be omitted with a view to substituting other words. The immediate question is that the amendment be agreed to. All those of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. I think the noes have it. As it is necessary to resolve this question to enable further questions to be considered in relation to this bill, in accordance with Standing Order 195, the bill will be returned to the House for further consideration. And I call the clerk.
Government Business Order of the Day number 2, Taxation, Multinational, Global and Domestic Minimum Tax Imposition Bill 2024, resumption of debate on the second reading.
The question is that this bill be now read a second time. All those of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. I'll put the question that this bill be now read a second time. All those of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. If no member wishes to I call the clerk.
Second reading, a bill for an act to impose a multinational top-up tax.
If no member wishes to consider the bill in detail, I will put the report question immediately. The question is that this bill be reported to the House without amendment. All those of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it, and I call the clerk.
Government Business Order of the Day number 3, Treasury Laws Amendment, Multinational, Global and Domestic Minimum Tax Consequential Bill 2024, resumption of debate on the second reading.
The question is that this bill be now read a second time. All those of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. I call the clerk.
Second reading, a bill for an act to make amendments consequent on the enactment of the Taxation, Multinational, Global and Domestic Minimum Tax Act 2024 and for related purposes.
If no member wishes to consider the bill in detail, I'll put the report question immediately. The question is that this bill be reported to the House without amendment. All those of that opinion say aye. The contrary, no. I think the ayes have it, and I call the clerk.
Government Business, next order of the day, Better and Fairer Schools Information Management Bill 2024, resumption of debate on the second reading.
The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I call the member for Sturt.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and I rise to speak on the second reading of the Better and Fairer Schools Bill. I commend the contribution made by the Lead Speaker for the Government in the House, the Manager of Opposition Business, who outlined that in principle we were supportive of what this bill purports to achieve, though there are a couple of concerns that I'll just touch on. Obviously, this bill indeed extends the unique student identifier to the schools sector. So this is something that already applies to people in the university and vet sector and will essentially link together the records management and tracking of students to earlier stages in their education, being those in the school sector. And the principle of that is not objectionable. The main point I just wanted to address is something that is going to be an ever-ongoing tension in bills like this that we consider going forth as technology in the digital world gives government the ability to create efficiencies with data. We need to balance that, and certainly in the Coalition we're very concerned about ensuring that we're balancing that with ever-increasing protections of people's privacy and making sure that we don't accidentally, from piece of legislation to piece of legislation, head down a path where there is a dangerous amount of information on individuals that's not properly protected and the privacy of those individuals is not protected. And as the Manager of Opposition Business mentioned in the House, we're very anxious to see what the government what the government's progress is in reviewing the Privacy Act, which has been reviewed periodically, certainly dates back to originally being passed in the late 80s, I think it was 1988 from memory. And it's really vitally important that when we talk about legislation like this, which we're not opposed to, that's putting another way for government to collect information on the Australian people, that whilst there are arguments of efficiency for government each time these bills come through, let's make sure that we're also reflecting on and increasing the protections of people's privacy and people's data, as government has a growing capability of bringing together multiple data points on people's various interactions with government, and we shouldn't have to delve into the merit and the need for the protection of the privacy of our citizens from the misuse of that data. When I think of myself, most people are probably the same. I mean, everyone has a Medicare number. Everyone has a driver's licence. Everyone has a driver's licence number, a tax file number. I think the Electoral Commission has some kind of number on us all when we're on the electoral roll. Clearly, if you access support through Services Australia, we all know as members of Parliament, the client numbers that Centrelink use and all the other different ways in which government collects information on people. We don't, and we should never have some kind of, central ID type requirement in our society where all information that government knows about you is centrally placed under one umbrella. And it's important that not only is information kept only where it needs to be on people and not inappropriately shared, but also that there is a strong legislative framework in place to make sure that there's not a risk of, without the knowledge of the Parliament in particular and the people therefore, that government isn't inappropriately building or bringing all this data together to do things with it that are not appropriately consented to by the people of Australia through the Parliament. So I'm not alleging at all that this bill is some kind of surreptitious attempt to do that. It's obviously the expansion of an existing scheme and existing principles that are already in place that were legislated when we were last in government to create this. The Student Identifiers Act, of course, was legislated when we were in government. This is expanding the people captured by it. We're not concerned by the principle of that, but we've made the important point that we just want to keep front of mind as bills that relate to the way in which we collect information on the Australian people, that we've got to, as we expand the way we do that, also expand the protections and the safeguards that are in place to make sure that the ever-increasing amount of data that is being stored on people is in no way open to abuse. And every time new schemes come in place, there's always a risk that some unforeseen or unintended consequence could come of that. So we would welcome the Minister in summing up on this bill, maybe just giving us some kind of elaboration on where the government is at with the Privacy Act and reflecting on the fact that this is another example of a new data record-keeping statute that could indeed justify reflecting on how the Privacy Act and other protections that are in place via the Information Commissioner, etc., are appropriately fit for purpose in the modern era of the way in which we collect data on the Australian people. But having made those comments, I intended to be brief, and I'll conclude at that point and commend this bill to the House and seek and hope from the government some update while we're passing this on where they're at with considering reviewing and improving the frameworks in place to protect information that we keep on people.
The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I call the member for Lawler.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Deputy Speaker, I'm pleased to hear that those opposite will be supporting this bill. Very pleased to hear that something that is long overdue and been a long time coming, and I speak obviously from a long time ago when I was in classrooms and a principal calling for a student identifier at a state level, and then supporting in 2014, supporting in this place the use of a unique student identifier across states as well, a national system, because it was sorely needed in schools when I was working in them. And let me go into the reason why a unique student identifier was important. So as someone working in a school in the government sector and working with local principals as well across sectors, it was incredibly difficult in transition periods between grade 6 and year 7 when families would enrol students into schools and then we'd roll around and January 27th would come. We'd get it past Australia Day and the first day of school would appear. The way the school system works is that schools are audited on student attendance and student enrolment. So there are a couple of points across the first 3 months of the year where if a student hasn't presented at a school or appear to be there on day 1 of school, then their enrolment can then be open to question. So where you have particularly vulnerable children, that transition period between grade 6 and year 7 is absolutely critical. I saw figures where potentially there were 30 children between grade 6 and year 7 who failed to transition to high school in my community back then. 30 students who just never showed up at high school. And without a unique student identifier, we can't say definitively that they haven't, because they could have enrolled in a school in the other sector. So they could have enrolled in a Catholic school even though they'd put an enrolment into the state sector. And we didn't have a system other than having relationships where I could ring the local Catholic primary schools or the local Christian schools or the local Islamic school and ask if they had an enrolment of this child. And even when I had done those calls and could say clearly to an auditor, looking at my school numbers, this child has not enrolled in the other sectors locally. And we are still pursuing the family. We're still knocking on the door. We're doing home visits at their last address to try and get this transition happening. And I could be told by an auditor, oh, they've probably moved to Melton. Probably. We're talking about an 11-year-old child whose future is on the line in the first 30 days of high school. And we know what happens if that transition doesn't happen. That child then becomes an intermittent learner, somebody who can completely fall through the cracks, can get to the end of year 7, has not attended a day of school. A failed transition becomes a statistic as a failed transition. So the unique student identifier in Victoria was a critical initiative that meant that we could sleep at night knowing that we knew where each child was, that they were enrolled in a school, that although they may not have taken up the enrolment in my school, I knew that they were in another school and that another principal, another year level coordinator, another welfare team were taking up the management of that child, particularly where we knew they were coming from vulnerable backgrounds. Critically important. Also important, in an era when people take children across state lines to avoid detection, equally important that we know where those children are. And we know that our systems are actually working together to ensure that every child is getting the guaranteed education that we legislate, that is legislated in this country. But this is just one more way of putting that layer in place to ensure that those who are working in the system to make sure every child's educated have the supports and the processes and the systems they need. To make sure that researchers, because we can use this data, de-identified, to tell us exactly how many failed transitions there are, how many children did not show up for school this year. And we can do so without it being a guess, with us actually knowing and therefore being able to set up processes to find those families and support those families to make sure that the children do make that transition. Because education is compulsory, and it's compulsory, that can vary state to state, compulsory to 17 in Victoria if you are either to be in school or to be pursuing further training. And you have to seek permission outside of that system to be employed full-time. And those permissions aren't that difficult to get, but there's a process so that we know where children are and we know that they are continuing to be in education or training and not fallen by the wayside. So that the funding that we're putting into schools is going to the places we need it to go to capture the students that are vulnerable in terms of their attendance or in terms of their completion. So I absolutely support this bill and hope that the negotiations continue around the use of the unique identifier, that sensible things occur around what they can be used for and what they can't be used for, that privacy is protected in the process, but that the de-identification of that data can be used to be useful to the systems that we have in place. Because it is an assumption. We all assume that we have schools compulsory, students are therefore attending. It's not always the case, particularly in vulnerable communities, particularly where that transition, any transition point, vulnerable students become more vulnerable. Changing schools becomes a transition point where students become vulnerable. So even if there's a change in schools because of a family move, young people are vulnerable at that point of becoming what we term a school refuser, someone who is uncomfortable and therefore reluctant and needs supports wrapped around them to keep them attending. With the best will, schools can't do this work without systemic support, and the unique identifier is something that I support, that I think will be of real value in communities like mine, where, as I say, we were given data that suggested that 30 kids had failed to transition. It's a lot of young people. It's a lot of kids not getting across to Year 7 who then become vulnerable in so many ways. And in communities where that kind of vulnerability exists and those failed transitions occur, we know what the end result is. The end result can often be a transition into a legal system and a transition into incarceration. So there's lots of compelling reasons for why this is a good idea. I wanted to make a contribution today to make sure that my colleagues understood what my compelling reasons are for this, that I believe override fears around privacy, although I still think that the negotiations ongoing between state ministers and the federal government will see sensible provisions in place to protect privacy, but more importantly, the initial decision, and it's a decision that's been bipartisan all the way through, that these were a good idea. The fears were mostly, I think, around this age group, around the school unique identifier, but I would commend everyone in this place to support the unique identifier and the way it will support teachers and schools and families, and ultimately support young people in their school journeys. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.
The question is that this bill be now read a second time, and I call the member for Dunkley.
Thank you, Acting Speaker. I'm very pleased to be speaking on the Better and Fairer Schools Bill 2024. This bill has been a long time coming. My colleague and friend, the member for Lalor, has been advocating for these reforms since 2009. She was a principal in schools in Victoria, and I appreciate the examples she's recently shared of why this bill is so important and her advocacy on the need for a unique student identifier. Acting Speaker, the bill may sound a little bland, but this is a really important issue to address. It centres around the unique student identifier that our students have. Essentially, the USI is a reference number made up of 10 numbers and letters. Basically, if you are a new or continuing student undertaking a nationally recognised or state qualification, a student in a Commonwealth, you need a USI. I'll start with a little history about the bill. Back in 2009, the Councils of Australian Governments, COAG, before it was dissolved, set out to create a national unique student identifier that could be used to track students as they progress through education and training. This was important for the higher education and vet experience of students. Good progress was made on the USI for vocational education and training courses, vet and higher education. However, it has taken until now to extend it to school students. So with this bill, we will be expanding the USI system from vet and higher education to primary school students. Students who will have a unique identifier that they will take with them throughout their education journey, not just higher education as is the status quo, secondary and primary school students will have one as well. It actually boggles the mind why this was not done in the first place. But anyway, now it's the last national policy initiative to be delivered under the current schools agreement. So what does this bill do? The bill itself is very simple. It makes the necessary technical changes. But I digress. It will allow the Student Identifiers Registrar, a statutory body under the Student Identifiers Act of 2014, to assign school identifiers. And then, in turn, the schools will just apply for school identifiers on behalf of their students. It will also empower the registrar to assign, validate and revoke student identifiers. And it authorises the registrar to use or disclose information for research purposes that meet requirements set by all education ministers. Importantly, it will give the unnecessary authority to the Minister for Education to recommend to the Governor-General the making of regulations under the Act. The next steps on how to harness the potential of schools USI's system will be a matter for discussion between the Commonwealth, states and territories, and is subject to an agreement at the Education Ministers' meeting. I think most importantly what this bill will do is ensure that we can keep an eye on our children and young people who are vulnerable, so we know they are at school or when they move. Because participating in school and education for the most vulnerable young people is an important safety net. Getting an education is a protective factor that enables children and young people to break the cycle of poverty and disadvantage. Privacy of information, as we all know so well, is incredibly important. This bill will protect privacy. There is nothing more important than safeguarding information about our children and teenagers. There are strong privacy protections in the bill. The bill introduces the concept of protected information into the Act, which includes student identifiers, school identifiers, and school identity management information. The information is subject to strict legislative restrictions to the collection, use, and disclosure of information. Information collected by the Registrar is subject to the Privacy Act 1988. State and territory privacy legislation will also apply to school identifier information. Education ministers have agreed to allow a student's school's identifier to travel with them when they move from one school system or one jurisdiction to another, supporting the robust and timely transfer of a student's information as they move from one school to another. Some of the future use cases that could be considered for this bill is helping ensure that students are not falling through the cracks by supporting jurisdictions to monitor when they leave one school and don't enrol in another. Future opportunities to connect the USI to NAPLAN so that parents and teachers can have ready access to the progress of their children over time. This information will be at their fingertips. Building our understanding of student pathways and can mean we better target and provide support to students and schools. Having a USI will enable more sophisticated data linkage and analysis to improve our understanding of student growth, progression and pathways. All future uses of the school's USI need to be agreed to by all education ministers through discussion. The bill is backed by major reviews. The school's USI has had the backing of major reviews. The Review to Achieve Educational Excellence in Australian Schools, the Productivity Commission Inquiry into Education, the Education Council STEM Partnerships Forum. These reports made the case that the USI is needed to drive consistency in the data collection, to maximise learning growth, supporting individual learning needs of students, to underpin innovation and continuous improvement, and improve our understanding of student pathways into school and beyond, and to track individual student performance. This is the last national policy initiative to be delivered under the current schools agreement, originally signed under the former government. I urge the Coalition to continue its commitment to this policy and that this bill enjoys bipartisan support.
The question is that this bill be now read a second time. I call the Minister.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Can I thank members for their contribution to this debate? The Better and Fairer Schools Information Management Bill will amend the Student Identifiers Act 2014 to extend the system of national unique student identifiers to the school sector. A unique school identifier in the schooling context will be called a schools identifier, and it will allow school students across the country to have a single identifier which will travel with them throughout their education, from school to higher education and vocational education and training. The bill meets the Commonwealth's obligations under the current National School Reform Agreement to get school identifiers underway, and it's an initiative which has enjoyed long bipartisan support and has been a long time coming. It was first agreed at COAG under the Rudd government in 2009 and then included a decade later in the National School Reform Agreement struck by the former coalition government, and now has finally been delivered by this government in this bill. The bill sets up the architecture for school identifiers to be issued to school students through the existing Office of the Student Identifiers Register. But the practical use cases for schools identifiers will be for agreement between myself and my state and territory ministerial colleagues through the Education Ministers' meetings. No use case will be implemented without the agreement of all education ministers. This is an important governance safeguard, and it is backed by robust privacy protections designed to ensure that any data collected is secure and used only for approved purposes. It's very important that we have privacy at the centre of this to ensure that we protect students whilst they benefit from the opportunities of a streamlined and unified identifier system that this offers. Once again, Mr Deputy Speaker, I thank members for their contribution and I commend the bill to the House.
I'll put the question. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Against? The ayes have it. The motion is carried and I call the clerk.
Second reading. The bill for an act to amend the Student Identifiers Act 2014 and for related purposes.
A message has been received from Her Excellency the Governor-General recommending, in accordance with Section 56 of the Constitution, an appropriation for the purposes of this bill. If no member wishes to consider the bill in detail, I will put the report question immediately. The question is that the bill be reported to the House without amendment. All those in favour? Against? Carried. I'll call the clerk.
Government business. Order of the day number 4. Death of Thomas Page Pritchard. Condolence motion.
I'll call a member for Riverina.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I wear the poppy pin in respect, remembrance and indeed awe. Today we gather again to pay tribute to Thomas Page Pritchard, and we should respect him. We do remember him and we are in awe of him. I look across the chamber and see the member for Spence, and I honour too his service as a private with the Army Reserves, and acknowledge all members in the Federal Parliament who served our great nation, who wore a uniform, because they are the best of the best. They are the bravest of the brave. And the one we pay special tribute today, Thomas Page Pritchard, was somebody who was a rat of Tobruk. Indeed, he was the last of the rats of Tobruk. During the African campaign, the North African campaign in World War II, Nazi propaganda radio broadcasts spoke supposedly contemptuously of the Tobruk defenders, labelling them as rats. Well, in true Aussie Army fashion, they took that as a badge of honour. And in defiance, the soldiers proudly adopted the nickname. In fact, during the siege, they designed their own medals in the shape of a rat made from the scrap metal of a downed German aeroplane. You just got to love. You've got to love Australians. You've got to love our soldiers. You've got to love those in the Australian Defence Forces. I note with interest last week that when the Prime Minister and the opposition leader began the tributes, the parliamentary speeches in relation to our fallen hero, neither of them, in their very eloquent remarks, mentioned Thomas Page Pritchard's age. There's probably a good reason for that, because no one's quite sure whether he was actually 102 or 103. Let's go with 103, because it was said that he was born in Portland, in Victoria, on the 25th of May 1921. But he was a man who lied about his age and said it was 1919 so that he could serve. He lied about his age so that he could line up with his friends, with his comrades, to serve our nation. These days, some men lie about their genders so they can compete in women's sport. This was the finest generation of men, of brave souls who went to serve their nation in times of peril. Enormous peril. None of them knew if they were ever going to return home, to return to the loving arms of family and friends. Yet many of them went to war and laid down their lives for their friends, for their nation. And I attended a war remembrance service in Wagga Wagga, home of the soldier, Kapooka Blamey Barracks, just the other day. And a veteran, a digger, came up to me and he said this was the greatest generation. And he was referring to those still living from World War II and those who sadly have gone to rest, their eternal rest. And he was right, because they were the greatest generation. And the siege of Tobruk in 1941, what a campaign. Australians fought in land and air campaigns in Egypt and Libya, in North Africa. And they were up against forces led by German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. And they had great respect for Rommel and his Africa Corps. And it was a vital campaign in World War II. But defenders at Tobruk, our men, our heroes, they had to adjust to life in stifling heat. Some of them were quite used to it, given the fact that they'd been in Australian summers, but this was a heat that was intense. They were under constant artillery and air bombardment. Supplies of food and water were limited. The troops were plagued by flies, by fleas, and by illness. And many of them would have been well aware, those who knew their history, of a campaign a little further south, the Boer War, of the Second Boer War, in fact, of 1899 to 1902, where more men died because of disease rather than bullets. But spirits remained high, as they always do, because that's our Australian soldiers. That is the spirit of the khaki, which stretches from the Boer War and Gallipoli right through World Wars, Vietnam, Malaya, Korea, Afghanistan, all the other campaigns. And we train the best of the best in my hometown. And we're very proud of that. We're very proud of being a garrison town. And Tom Pritchard's loss is very much was felt keenly at Kapooka, because they know, they understand that this was an iconic figure who, because of his death, that link in that heritage had been severed. And Mr. Pritchard was also well aware of the responsibility that he had probably unwantingly shouldered as the lone known surviving Australian rat. And in 2020, his dying mate and fellow Tobruk veteran, Alf Jackson, who was 101, he asked him to carry the torch for those who had passed on. And Alf knew that he wasn't long of this world. And he said, "Can you do that for me, Cobber?" And Mr Pritchard said he would try. Those who knew him described him as a quiet and thoughtful man, and like many World War II veterans, he didn't like to talk of battles past and battles won and sufferings endured. But he and his mates helped win the war against the Axis, against the Germans. And he and his mates are responsible for the fact that we now can live free, that we now have a democracy that we should be proud of, that we should at all times uphold. And we live in very troubled times. We've got Ukraine, we've got the situation in the Middle East, and we've got many Australians who perhaps would not be so keen to don a uniform and to defend our country. But it's the ideals that Mr Pritchard had in spades that we should try to live up to at all times. And we should remember him and all others, the 103,000 names on the Australian War Memorial Roll of Honour, just down the road. We should remember them, not just on April 25, Anzac Day, not just on November 11, Remembrance Day, Armistice Day, but every day, because we owe so much to them. We should always remember. Thank you, Mr Pritchard, lest we forget.
The question is that the motion be agreed to, and I call the member for Spence.
Well, thank you, Acting Deputy Speaker. And firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the very fine words from the member for Riverina. I wouldn't expect anything else, given that the fine member was the Defence Personnel and Veterans Affairs Minister for some time, and also having Kapuka in his garrison town, a place that I have fond memories of. I expect nothing less, so thank you for those fine words. I too rise to pay my respects to the late Thomas Page Pritchard, the last living Rat of Tobruk, and commemorate and thank him for his service. I would like to acknowledge all current and former Australian personnel as well, and thank you for your service. I also extend my deepest sympathies to his family in their time of bereavement. Tom's passing on the 3rd of August 2024 marks the physical end of one of the most distinguished groups of servicemen in our national history. The Rats of Tobruk, their name an iconic embrace of insults hurled by the Nazi propagandists during the Second World War, symbolised the very essence of the Australian spirit, bringing to the world, through their actions, an unbreakable resilience in the face of the toughest of conditions, but immersed in our unique humour. They could only be Australians. And Tom's own story is typical of the Rats. He enlisted underage, like many young Australians at the outbreak of conflict across the world, to serve with a distinction and honour reserved for the most experienced of men, but complete with a wicked sense of humour and sense of wit, echoing just some of the testaments from those who served and lived with Tom. He has lived a remarkable life, like all Australians and our allies who fought in Tobruk for the betterment of our nation, both then and now. But Tom was also an incredibly modest person and did not want a fuss to be made on him being the last living Rat of Tobruk. In paying my respects to him and expressing my condolences to his loved ones, I'd like to respect those wishes and leave his personal story there. But regarding the Rats of Tobruk, their collective story warrants significant respect and commemoration, and I'll pay tribute to them as a whole. Tom and the 14,000 of the Australian Brothers in Arms, alongside thousands of their allied comrades, would defend the port city of Tobruk for over 7 months. With backs to the ocean, although their wit would remain as dry as the deserts of Libya, this garrison would deny and defy the Nazi war machine that was besieging them, despite extreme external pressure and a significant lack of supply. This garrison would suffer nearly 4,000 casualties, most of them whom were Australian. The Australian War Memorial states that 832 Australians from the 9th Division were killed during the siege. The Rats of Tobruk are extraordinary, having given their lives to bear toughest of conditions. in the interest of our nation, to serve as a significant part in the defence of democracy and freedom against the very real danger of dictatorship and tyranny. And it's important to remember not just the sacrifice of the rats, but that these were just everyday Australians doing incredible things. Everyday Australians like my great uncle Lyle Sidney Taylor, another rat of Tobruk who passed in 1972 before I was born. I remember my father speaking of his service with immense pride on a regular basis. You can find Lyle's name on the Roll of Honour in the Curler Memorial Hall, ensuring his service is recognised through generations, alongside dozens of others who served from 1939 to 1945. It is important that he is remembered, like all the rats of Tobruk, like all serving men and women through our history, and collectively we do so. We do so in memorials like that on Anzac Parade just over the way here in Canberra, like the tributes along the Northern Expressway in Adelaide, in ceremonies like on Anzac Day and on anniversaries commemorating fateful days where Australians would take up arms, and in our schools as we learn the national story as children. And we do this because the sacrifice of our servicemen and women from across our nation, wherever they may have been in the world in the past, helps give context to our values and our culture and the present, because their experiences in serving our country have helped to forge the traits and qualities we pride ourselves on today. Things like Australian mateship and humour, things like Australian resilience and the unbreakable spirit of our people, in remembering our servicemen and women, in recognising the conscious decision an Aussie makes to commit themselves to defend our way of life. Australia traces a thread upon which the nation was spun and continues that story into the future. And the rats of Tobruk, in the words they have written in the Australian story, likewise left an inspiring and enduring page in that book, underscoring in their actions the courage, comradeship and sheer determination of the Australian people, lighting the torch that Australians today will continue to pass on for generations to come. So while Tom Pritchard's passing is a significant loss for Australia, his life and those of the rats of Tobruk will live on for as long as the Australian spirit itself. Thank you, Thomas Page Pritchard, for your service. Rest in peace.
I thank the member. The question is that the motion be agreed to, and I call the member for Moncrieff.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker, and I thank the member for Spence for his words, and I invite him, if he has time, to stay for my contribution here, as it's constituents from his electorate that I will be talking about. It is with no doubt the biggest honour of an MP's life, indeed of my life, to stand here and in this place speak about some of the heroes of World War II, those brave soldiers who faced the enemy in the siege of Tobruk from April 11th to December 10, 1941. 8 months of brutal fighting. I start by paying tribute to the last rat of Tobruk to pass, Thomas Page Pritchard, and I extend my condolences to his family and pay tribute to his service, to his country and to the Commonwealth. On the honour roll, which I looked up, he's listed as Tom, a driver, born 24th of August 1921, which is not the same as what the member for Riverina just outlined, but I did look it up on the honour roll. VX 23441 was his number, the 2nd 5th Field Ambulance, and that would make him 103 if he were indeed alive today. Tom's service helped to preserve our freedom and our rights as we enjoy them in our democratic nation today, and we must continue to remember those who fought so bravely for us. I humbly thank him for his sacrifices and for those of all servicemen and women, past, present and into the future. I highlight those serving men and women at Kokoda Barracks in Canungra, close to my electorate on the Gold Coast, and those at the 5th 11th Battery, 9th Regiment Royal Australian Artillery, that is RAA, and B Company, a 25th 49th Battalion Royal Queensland Regiment at Ashmore in my electorate. It was also the service and sacrifices of 2 brothers from Broken Hill, Herget Springs to be precise, now known as Maree, off the Oodnadatta track in South Australia, that I would like to highlight for the House and for the history books. Colin Arthur, born 26th of the 9th, 1919, SX 5015, was 22, and Morris Jeffrey, born 31st of August 1921, was just 20, SX 5014. Just 2 years between those two boys. Both privates served, unusually in the same battalion, in the 2nd 43rd. They fought side by side to save each other and to save their families from the enemy. They fought for our democracy. They fought so we didn't have to. They fought with courage. Colin and Morris both returned from the war, but with injuries they lived for with the rest of their lives. Colin moved to Western Australia and was badly affected by the war. He isolated himself from the family unit until his passing, of which there are no details. The honour roll says he is still alive, actually. But if he were, he would be 105 years old, and Tom Pritchard would not be the last to pass. And so that scenario for the House is fairly unlikely. Of his younger brother, Colin's younger brother, Morris, a vignette from Elizabeth. Here's where it gets hard. In South Australia. Circa 1975, a small girl sat on her old Uncle Mott's knee and giggled about the hard lumps in his gnarled fingers and wondered innocently why he had a glass eye. He always smiled, and he never talked of the horrors of war, especially to children. But his family knew that he was the only soldier in Tobruk. To step on an anti-personnel mine and survive to tell the tale. He lost an eye, and his legs were badly damaged in the blast. Not just his hands, but his body too was riddled with shrapnel. That young innocent girl was 7-year-old me. My grandmother, Doreen Marion Bell, after whom I'm named, was born the 16th of March 1916, and she died on the 13th of August 2012, aged 96 years old. Her much-loved baby brothers, Colin and Mott, both survived and both served together. They returned from Tobruk to many and to marry and to have their own families. To close, I want to thank driver Tom Pritchard for his service to our nation, to those who returned and sadly those who never had the chance to start their own families, to all the rats of Tobruk, and to the Bell brothers from Hergot Springs, thank you. On behalf of my dearly beloved Nana, Doreen Marion, Colin and Mott's older sister, my father Roger, his two brothers Trevor and Ian, and my wider family, we will remember them, lest we forget.
I thank the member. You haven't got another speaker? Okay. The question is that the motion be agreed to, and I call the member for... No, it's a quorum. We won't have quorum here.
Once quorum's lost,
yeah.
you just suspend
Yeah.
like quorum, but you wait until the quorum's gone. So you can just say the chair will be resumed once quorum is present.
As quorum is not present, the Federation Chamber is now suspended. It'll be resumed once quorum is present. question is that the motion be agreed to, and I call the member for Wannon.
Thanks, Deputy Speaker. And it is a great honour to stand here and to remember Tom Pritchard, a rat of Tobruk. And I say that incredibly sincerely, Deputy Speaker, because I've had the great honour to go to Tobruk and to see where our rats of Tobruk served. It's obviously a desolate spot in Libya. It is a port, but it's the smallest of ports, and there is nothing around it. It is desert, and where our rats of Tobruk fought, there is a couple of trees. There is no protection, there is no shelter, and the way that they dug themselves in and the way that they fought on our behalf is something that I think is truly, truly remarkable. And when you go there, it's hard to see the strategic importance that it had at the time, but it was seen as having immense strategic importance, and that is why they dug in, and that is why they are legends in this. They are legends of our country. Now, Tom himself was born in Portland in my electorate, and so there is a significant attachment to the electorate of Wannon when it comes to Tom's life, because that is where he was born. And also he worked in Hamilton in my electorate. He was a SES employee, and he worked in Hamilton for a period of time. And I don't know this, but I could only imagine that he probably knew the other rats of Tobruk from the electorate of Wannon. And Jack Capel, who sadly passed away a few years ago, was another great rat of Tobruk who I had the great honour of knowing and discussed with him what it was like to fight and serve at Tobruk, and having been there myself, to ask him questions about what they thought about defending the terrain there at Tobruk. And I must say, when we went to Tobruk, we held a commemorative service at the war graves at Tobruk. It was extraordinarily moving. And the one thing that has never left me is the way, and you know, this is where the Commonwealth War Graves people need our utmost respect, and it was local Libyans who did it on their behalf. The way that those war graves are respected and the way they are kept is exemplary and a true tribute to everyone. Deputy Speaker, it's incredibly important that we always remember those who have served on our behalf, and that we continue to remember them in the most dignified way for their service. It was a great honour over the weekend to have Sir Peter Cosgrove and Lady Lynn Cosgrove visit the electorate of Wannon on Sunday to come to Warrnambool. Now, Sir Peter is the most highly decorated officer ever to come to Warrnambool. And it was wonderful to have him, and the community really, really appreciated his visit. He came to local legacy and spoke there and was able to thank all those wonderful legatees for the work that they do right across the electorate of Wannon. He then went to the cadets, and we've got Army cadets, we've got Navy cadets, and we've got Air Force cadets, and they were able to assemble and parade in front of him. It was wonderful to see these young cadets all doing their bit, many of them wanting to go on and serve their nation into the future, parade in front of him, and they loved having him there, and it was great to see. And then together we did the Vietnam Veterans commemorative event, and as everyone knows, it was Vietnam Veterans Day on Sunday, so we had a very, very moving commemorative event at the Warrnambool RSL. So Peter was able to lay a reef, and then some of our Vietnam veterans then gave a guest speech on what it was like in Vietnam during the war, and were able to remember the service of Air Commodore Peter Raw. Now, Air Commodore Peter Frank Raw was a senior officer and pilot in the Royal Australian Air Force. He saw combat in a heavy bomber unit in the European theatre during the later stages of World War II, and as a senior officer in Vietnam, serving in many flying training and administrative roles. And the way that his role in particular in Vietnam was able to be laid out was incredibly important, and I've got to say of great information to everyone who was there. Just to give you a sense of the record of Air Commodore Peter Raw, he was a companion of the Distinguished Service Order, Distinguished Flying Cross, Air Force Cross, 1939 to 1945 Star, Africa Star, Defence Medal, War Medal 1939 to 1945, Australian Service Medal 39 to 45, Australian Active Service Medals 45 to 75 with clasp, Vietnam Medal, Australian Service Medal 45 to 75 with clasp, SE Asia, Queen Elizabeth II Silver Jubilee Medal 1977, Defence Force Service Medal with first, second, third and fourth clasps, National Medal and first and second clasps, Australian Defence Medal, Cross of Valour, Poland, Republic of Vietnam Campaign Medal and the Warsaw Uprising Cross. Extraordinary the way that he served our nation, and can I say to Peter's wife, you should be rest assured that Peter's service at all times was exemplary, and he did his best and always tried to do by the best by his nation. To our Vietnam veterans in Warrnambool and right across southwest Victoria, thank you for what you continue to do to commemorate the war service of all those who fought in Vietnam. And can I end where I started? It is just so important that we remember those who have served for us and do it in the most dignified and respectful way.
I thank the member for his contribution. The question is that the motion be agreed to, and I call the member for New England.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. I rise today as the Shadow Member for Veterans Affairs and speaking in regards Tom Pritchard, who was one of many but the last of all when it comes to the rats at Tobruk. I think it's important to start, why was Tobruk important? Mr Deputy Speaker, holding Tobruk held a port. If they didn't hold that port, what holding that port meant was that the delivery of resupplies had to come from Tripoli. So Rommel, who was Africa Corps, was dominating the fight in North Africa, and they had a garrison of around about 14,000, 12,000. I'll just check that. That was holding this port, and overwhelmingly they were Australians. If they'd lost it, then they wouldn't have to take the supplies from Tripoli. They could get supplies in from Tobruk. Now, holding it meant that Rommel had to take supplies, and the Italians, who were sort of fading a bit then, had to take supplies from 1,500 kilometres away. So it's a bit like holding Brisbane, and because you hold Brisbane, the enemy have to resupply from Adelaide. So very, very important that they held out. And not only holding from Adelaide, you'd have to be moving supplies from Adelaide across the desert. So this gives you the reason of the importance of this. It was made up of the 9th Division and one from the 7th Division. So your 9th Division and the brigades were the 20th, the 24th and the 26th. And from the 7th Division, it was the 15th. There was one, it talks about the period that went from April the 8th, to October the 25th. But the final relief of the garrison, didn't happen actually till December, and there was I think it was the 2nd, 13th that had to stay there. Battalion, the 2nd, 13th had to stay there till the final relief. It was obviously, we know that during the day, searing heat, during the night, freezing cold, real issues in trying to keep water, fresh water up to them, dietary requirements. We also lost naval ships going in there. It was under siege. We had the Luftwaffe bombing the naval vessels, and because we had Rommel in front of them and the Luftwaffe behind them, and so this was really savage. And that's during that period from April to October, 749 people were killed, 1,996 were injured, and of course more were killed outside that period. Of eight, there was about 832 for the whole of the process to the end of the siege, which was in December. There was relief of the garrison in October because, and I'm sure the Labor Party members are very aware of this, there was a move to make sure that we went back to the protection of Australia, and that was incredibly important as well. And I think that was a very wise move because our issues were closer to home, with the Japanese making their way down through the peninsula and, of course, into New Guinea, where New Guinea, being a protectorate of Australia, they were on land administered by Australia. I think it's very important we say that because people say, oh, the Japanese wouldn't have got to Australia. Well, they actually did. They did. They were bombing Darwin, bombing Broome, bombing Townsville, and they were on what was then the Australian protectorate of New Guinea. So. And they weren't wasting lives because there was no purpose to it. Once they got the port of Port Moresby, we were in real strife. Why is that important? Because these people, after they'd finished with Tobruk, that's where they went. They went to New Guinea, and that's where Tom Pritchard went. And Tom Pritchard, so after he did his time as a medic in Tobruk, then he had to go to Papua New Guinea. He went from the desert to the jungle. He got malaria twice. So apart from being shot at, being bombed, he was also dealing with the afflictions of what happens in diseases in these areas, and people often lose sight of that. It's not just the enemy; it's the environment that can cause so many problems. And if you had malaria twice, it's not good for your health forevermore. It's a wonder he made it to the age he did. Now, so what do we take? And then when he got home, but the biggest thing about these people, I think is remarkable, is you think of the sacrifice. Like when he went off, Tom Pritchard put his age down to go to war because I think he wanted to be with his other family members, or his mates had gone off and he wanted to be with them. Mother wasn't too happy about it, and that's often the case. My grandfather went off to war when he was 16. I've seen photos of him, he looked 16. And the issue is, these people, when they went off, they had all the reasons to stay at home. Young, probably, I don't know, they would have been like playing sport, they would have enjoyed life, they would have enjoyed their mates, they might have had a girlfriend, and the old ones might have had a wife. They had all the reasons to stay at home, all the reasons not to go. But they went. Why did they go? A range of reasons, but the core reason is because they were worried about Australia. They were worried about what happened to our nation, and they had to do something about it. And inside their own hearts, they said, I'm going to do something about it. I'm going to make the sacrifice. And after they did that, they did all that, you'd think they'd come home and say, oh, that'll do me. I have filled my book of service to this nation. I'm over it. But even Tom Pritchard's a classic example. He came back and worked for the SES. They actually came back and continued on their service for their nation. And I saw that with a gentleman by the name of Phelps, just to use an example, a gentleman by the name of Phelps at St George. Every morning, he was in New Guinea as well, so pertinent to this. Every morning, before sunrise, he'd take his sheepdog and he'd go down to the foreshore at St George and walk on the path with a stick with a spike at the end of it and pick up the papers, pick up the rubbish. I used to say to him, why do you do that? You're an older man. He goes, well, I love this country. But he never had a go at the people who dropped the papers. He just decided that he was going to get up every morning and pick them up. And he was also in Rotary, and it was just, where I looked at him, I just thought, it's just a life of service. He offered his life, put his life on the line. Then he got home and just never stopped. And that was apart from bringing up his family and looking after his grandkids. And never ever said, I want to get an Australia Day award or anything like that. Just Yeah, this is my own business. I do it quietly, and that's just the way it is. Now, what Tom Pritchard and his name is Gordon Phelps, what these people will say to us is, I believe, what type of people are we? Would we do it? If the problems arose again, would people say, I'm off to North Africa? I'm off to Papua New Guinea? Would they do it basically without question? And when they came home, would they just go back to work? Would they just say, I've done my bit, I'm back to work? Are we as tough as them? Are we as resilient as them? Because unfortunately circumstances have made it that this might be we live in a very, very special time, the people in this room. Your children, your grandkids are going to live in a different time because the world has changed. Totalitarianism, which Tom Pritchard was up against, I mean the evilness of fascism, a regime that believed in destroying a race of people who enslaved, and who not just the Jews but also the Gypsies, who believed the Slavic people were second-class citizens. They just starved them in the prisoner of war camps, threw them in a couple of potatoes, watched the fun as they clawed over it like impoverished and famished people. This was a regime we're up against. It was bad. It was very, very bad. It was an evil regime. My grandfather and my father was in the services during the Second World War. He got smashed up. My grandfather fought. They wouldn't even let you draw a swastika. Wouldn't let you draw it. Just not allowed. Not allowed in the house. They were absolutely 100% held them in contempt. They really, really, it was serious. There were certain things in the house you just were not allowed to say. You were not allowed to say. What I can say about them, even my father, who's passed away now, they were real steel about them. They were not, they really disliked what they call malingerers, people who feigned an injury, who weren't quite perfect, so therefore they thought that they were afflicted. Because my dad, he'd smashed up. His leg was all mangled up. And they just worked. They just went to work. And they just believed that your duty continued on. Duty to your family, your duty to your nation. You muscled through. They'd always say, and as in a young age, so, in a polite way, in a firm way, in a funny sort of quasi-compassionate way, they say, you got to suck it up, mate. Suck up your lemons, get going, get through it. So the question is for us, when we look at Tom Pritchard, one of many, but the last of all, have we still got that steel? Have we got it? Because we're going to need it. Do we instill that in our children and our grandchildren? Do we say to them, if you're really hurt, we're really got to look after you. But if you're only a little bit hurt, you just got to deal with it. You just got to deal with it and get through. Because we have now again, the unfortunate rise of totalitarianism. It's there again. You got it. The unilateral control by a regime in the north, which once more is incarcerated and belittle over 1 million people, the Uyghur nation, just taking over areas. And what Tom Pritchard says to us right now, and I think it's important, on his passing, is we have got to get that toughness back into us. We really have to. Because if you don't, you're going to lose this country. Yeah, people think, it'll just happen, it'll just stay there. You won't. Read your history books. Things just don't stay there. If you're not tough enough, you lose them. You lose them. So every parent has a responsibility when your kid goes out in the soccer field or the footy field or the netball courts, or that, to say you got to muscle through this. You got to deal with it. So I want to say with great thanks the work of Tom Pritchard, the life of Tom Pritchard, the service of Tom Pritchard, but not just Tom alone, emblematic of all those 14,000 soldiers in the garrison of Tobruk, and those who then went on to fight once more in Papua New Guinea for the protection of our sacred and land that we love so much. Tom makes us say, first and foremost, thank you for everything you did. It makes us respect the fact that they really didn't ask much for it. They just did it. And then they came home and went back to work. And most importantly, it says to us, if you're going to show any sort of respect for them, if you have it, the biggest thing you must never do is forget they did it. Because if you forget they did it, then you believe they did it for nothing. You believe they did it for free. You believe that their life and their sacrifice and their marriages breaking up and those who were killed and those families who were decimated and those people who came back and their mind wasn't in the square it was when it went away and those careers that were just left behind and those who came back and just lost, we see them now, died back in civilian life and ended up in an unmarked grave. We believe they did it for nothing. That we were entitled to them to do it. We have an entitlement. We have no entitlement. We have a debt. No entitlement, a debt. And that's why for Tom Pritchard, we say thank you very much, and for all the others, we say lest we forget.
I thank the member. I understand it's the wish of honourable members to signify at this stage of respect and sympathy by rising in their places, and I ask all present to do so. I thank the Federation Chamber. I call the member for Canberra.
I ask leave of the Federation Chamber to move that further proceedings be conducted in the House.
Leave granted.
I move that further proceedings be conducted in the House.
The motion. The question is that further proceedings be conducted in the House. All of those of that opinion say aye. Against? I think the ayes have it. The motion is carried, and as the time is nearly 1 p.m, the Federation Chamber is now suspended and will recommence when the chair is resumed at 4 p.m.